Hidden inside the games you grew up with, small truths have been waiting quietly for someone patient enough to find them. Hoenn was a region built on water and mystery, on volcanic peaks and oceanic trenches, on a story that began with a single step out of a very small house in a town that barely had a name. The 135 Pokémon that called this region home each carried their own private histories, details tucked gently into the edges of their designs, their names, their habits, and the quiet logic of the world they inhabited. And before we continue our journey, please consider subscribing to join the Cozy Club for more journey like this, and let me know where in the world you are currently watching from tonight. As we begin with the very first Pokémon that countless trainers chose at the start of their Hoenn adventure, and that Pokémon was Trico, a small green creature that moved with an unhurried confidence found rarely in anything so new. Trico was the grass-type starter that introduced a generation of players to the sun-drenched roads and tangled forests of the Hoenn region. In the Pokémon anime, there existed an unusually old Trico, a creature that stood apart from the rest of its kind in ways that felt almost melancholy when the scene was allowed to settle. That particular Trico was the last of its group, lingering near a great tree that had slowly stopped bearing fruit, and its presence in those episodes raised quiet questions about age and loyalty that the show rarely addressed so directly or with such unhurried patience. The detail sits in the memory of those who watched it, a small creature refusing to leave a place it had always known, the kind of stubbornness that is indistinguishable from love when you are standing close enough to it. A different but equally memorable moment came through Ash's own Trico, specifically through the way it learned Bullet Seed, which is one of those scenes that the anime handled with more internal logic than most battle sequences ever achieved. In the anime, it was Natasha's Grovyle who taught the move, using watermelon seeds as a demonstration that worked as both a storytelling device and a surprisingly grounded glimpse into how move tutoring might actually function in the broader world of these games. A Pokémon watches, a Pokémon processes, and something that seemed impossible becomes second nature by the following morning, absorbed through observation rather than explanation. It was a small scene that passed quickly and was never referenced again, but it stayed with certain viewers in the way that small scenes sometimes do, long after the episode's larger plot had faded. Sapphire carried that lineage forward in a way that felt physical and deliberate, grounding the creature's combat style in something that moved like the real world. When Mega Sceptile attacks, the tail launches forward like a projectile, functioning in battle the same way a real lizard might weaponize its body in moments of genuine danger when other options have closed. The comparison to actual lizard biology grounded the design in something tangible and observable, a reminder that many of Hoenn's creatures were built on careful observation of the natural world before anything fantastical or exaggerated was layered thoughtfully on top. Torchic held a detail so small that most players never thought to look for it in 20 years of playing, yet so specific that once known, it cannot easily be forgotten or set aside. Male Torchics carry a faint black marking near the base of their tail, a feature that references a real agricultural practice used by Japanese poultry farmers in the early 1900s. During that era, visually distinguishing male chicks from female chicks was considered essentially impossible without highly specialized knowledge that most farmers could not easily access or apply. The black marking on a male Torchic was the designer's way of encoding that specific history into the design itself, a piece of agricultural memory hidden inside a cheerful fire-type starter that most players carried through the first few hours of their journey without ever pausing to study. Combusken carried its own small story through its shiny form, a story that took 15 years to complete. For 15 years, the alternate coloration of Combusken presented the creature in tones that were different from its standard appearance, a change that had slipped into the games and remained there long past the point when anyone might have noticed it. Then a game update quietly changed the shiny form back to its original red feathers, restoring what had been altered without announcement or explanation. 15 years is a very long time for an unintended change to persist unnoticed across multiple releases and re-releases, and the correction was so understated that many players only learned of it afterward when the difference had already been restored and the previous version was already becoming a memory. Blaziken's earliest design concepts were stranger than most players ever imagined when they first chose it as their starter and began their journey through Hoenn. During the planning stages of Ruby and Sapphire, the developers explored a version of Blaziken that drew visual inspiration from Latias, creating an early hybrid aesthetic that never reached completion or the final game. An even more unexpected detail surfaced in concept materials, suggesting that Latios may have been intended to ride on Blaziken's back, a pairing that would have reshaped how players thought about both Pokémon and about the relationship between the legendary and non-legendary members of the roster. The final designs moved well away from these ideas, but the traces of those early explorations remain fascinating to consider as a glimpse of the paths not taken. Mudkip occupied a different kind of strangeness in the anime, where giant versions of the creature appeared in a role that felt ecologically unusual when compared to what the evolutionary line's lore suggested. In the animated series, oversized mudkips were shown guarding nests and protecting newly hatched young, a caregiving behavior that might more naturally be expected of their fully evolved form, Swampert, which was large enough and powerful enough to serve that function effectively. The reversal of that expectation drew quiet attention from viewers who noticed it, raising the sort of question that the games and the anime each resolve differently, depending on which version of the world feels most internally consistent on any given day. Marshtomp earned a distinction that had nothing to do with battle ability or Pokédex lore, and everything to do with expression. It was the design itself, the particular arrangement of features on its face, that prompted the official Pokémon Twitter account to acknowledge with a kind of amused institutional honesty that Marshtomp simply looks like a psychopath. The official recognition of something that fans had noticed and discussed for years added a layer of self-awareness to the franchise that felt genuinely charming, a rare moment when the franchise itself looked at one of its own creatures and admitted what everyone had quietly been thinking. Swampert's competitive history contained a number somewhere so large that it required a dedicated video to explain the conditions that produced it. Under the right sequence of events and the right conditions in battle, a Swampert was calculated to be capable of dealing 566 million points of damage in a single exchange. The number is the kind that strains comprehension when read plainly, and the conditions required to reach it were themselves extraordinary and deliberate. But the fact that it was achievable within the game's own rules and systems made it real in the strictest technical sense. The games contained many numbers like this one, possible only under circumstances that required imagination and precision to construct. Poochyena and Mightyena were among the first wild Pokémon that many players encountered in Hoenn, appearing on the earliest routes and establishing the region's early visual character before anything more exotic appeared. Their evolution required a certain number of battles, a simple mechanical threshold that rewarded persistence, and the fully evolved Mightyena became a dependable partner whose dark typing added coverage that many of the early routes required. The straightforwardness of the design was part of its appeal, a wolf Pokémon that was exactly what it appeared to be. Zigzagoon in Pokémon Emerald occupied a specific narrative function at the very opening of the game that most players experienced without fully processing. The wild Zigzagoon that chased Professor Birch into an exposed position in the opening sequence forcing the player to choose their first Pokémon, and battle in defense of the distressed professor could not be defeated by the player's starter, no matter how the battle progressed. When the starter's health dropped low enough, the Zigzagoon would simply turn and flee, ensuring that the encounter ended before any conclusion the player might find embarrassing could occur. The game protected its opening from failure in a way that was quiet, mechanical, and entirely in service of the player's experience. Lanoune carried a mechanical truth in its Pokédex description that a later game brought to life in a way that rewarded players who had read carefully. The entry described Lanounes as a creature that always moved at full speed, that only traveled in straight lines, and that executed sharp right-angle turns when direction changes were needed rather than gradual curves or organic adjustments. When Sword and Shield brought Lanoune into a new generation and made it visible in the overworld, players could observe exactly that behavior during encounters, watching the creature zigzag across the environment in precisely the pattern the text had described years before the visual representation existed. The consistency was a small gift to attentive players who had carried that piece of text in their memory. Wurmple's branching evolution carried a mechanic that players spent years trying to crack, testing theories about level, time of day, nature, location, and a dozen other variables that all turned out to be irrelevant. Whether a given Wurmple would become Silcoon and eventually Beautifully, or Cascoon and eventually Dustox, was determined entirely by a hidden personality value embedded in the Pokemon's data at the moment of encounter. No external factor that the player controlled influenced the outcome. No item, no move, no location, no choice made after the encounter began could shift the path. The result was fixed before the player had any opportunity to act, and the randomness was genuine and complete. One of the rare moments in these games where the player's influence over their own journey was simply absent. Silcoon had a quieter detail visible on a specific Pokemon card that captured its developmental period with unusual specificity. While awaiting its evolution inside its protective casing, Silcoon used a soap-like substance to clean itself against the bark of nearby trees, a grooming behavior that connected the pupation stage to the natural world in an unexpectedly ordinary way. Most cocoon Pokemon existed in a state of complete suspended waiting, their entries describing stillness and accumulation. Silcoon apparently found ways to stay occupied in small ways during its long pause, which made the developmental stage feel less like an absence and more like a different kind of presence. Beautifully's Pokédex entries carried a detail that sat in direct contrast with its appearance, the kind of contrast that the games occasionally constructed without drawing attention to it. The aggressive eyes, the long, narrow mouth, the practiced habit of piercing into prey and drawing fluids, while the creature itself remained outwardly graceful and lovely, all suggested that Beautifully's elegance was a presentation rather than a complete description. Beauty and predation had been woven together into a single design, and the tension between the two was never resolved because the game never needed to resolve it. The creature could be admired for its appearance and understood for its behavior simultaneously, and neither reading canceled the other out. Cascoon established a different kind of patience in its entries, one that carried consequence across evolutionary stages. According to its descriptions, Cascoon did not respond or move, even when struck during its vulnerable developmental state, absorbing every attack without retaliation. The pain from those strikes was not forgotten. When Cascoon eventually transformed into Dustox, the memory of every creature that had hurt it during that period remained intact, and the evolved form would eventually seek out those responsible. The sequence of stillness, then memory, then delayed consequence was a small story told across two evolutionary stages without a single line of dialogue or cutscene, the kind of storytelling that existed purely in the space between entries. Dustox held a peculiar distinction in the history of poison-type interactions before the corrosion ability existed as a game mechanic. Through a specific sequence involving Cascoon's bug, typing during evolution, Dustox was the only poison-type Pokémon that could arrive in a poisoned state through a pathway available in normal gameplay without requiring the corrosion ability to bypass the standard immunity that poison types carried. The path to that result required specific conditions that most players never set up intentionally, but the technical pathway was genuine, and it made Dustox unique among its type in a way that no other entry in the Pokédex matched. Lotad's Pokédex entries described it as a creature willing to carry smaller Pokémon across bodies of water on its large rounded leaf hat, positioning it as a kind of miniature aquatic transport for creatures that lacked the swimming capability to cross on their own. The image it created was gentle and cooperative, a small, round creature floating across still water with passengers who trusted its stability. The comparison to Lapras was made occasionally by fans who noticed the parallel, a gentle giant of the open sea, alongside a gentle small creature of the quiet pond, each offering passage to those who needed it. Lombre carried a detail embedded in the characters of its Chinese name that most players who encountered it in the Pokémon centers of Hoenn would never have discovered. The characters used to write that name translated directly to something resembling Lotus Hat Lad, a description that captured both the visual design, the plant-based hat structure, and the cultural texture of the creature in 3 compact syllables. Names carry meaning that transcends their function as simple labels, and Lombre's name in Chinese did exactly that kind of work. Ludicolo expressed one of the more joyful lore details in the entire Hoenn roster, a fact about physiology that had direct game design implications when read carefully. According to its Pokédex entries, when Ludicolo heard festive music, every cell in its body became stimulated with energy, raising its capabilities and heightening its awareness in battle. The Pokémon Colosseum villain Mirror B, whose flamboyant presentation was defined by his love of dance and whose team consisted primarily of Ludicolos, used a battle theme that was composed specifically to be festive and rhythmically energetic. The music was not simply characterization, it was the strategy itself, and the choice to use it collapsed the boundary between gameplay atmosphere and lore accuracy in a way that rewarded players who had paid attention to the Pokédex entries for creatures that often went unread. Seedot used the top of its head as an anchor, attaching itself to tree branches and drawing moisture from the living wood below in a process that sustained it through its early developmental phase. The more water it consumed during this daily process, the more the outer surface of its body glossed over and caught light. The image of small, round brown creatures hanging from forest branches, slowly becoming more luminous as they fed, was one of those Pokédex details that made the forests of Hoenn feel genuinely inhabited by things living their own lives, independent of any trainer's journey. Nuzlev presented a contradiction that endured quietly across multiple generations of games without it ever being addressed. Several Pokédex entries clearly and specifically described Nuzleaf, using the leaf growing on its head as a kind of flute instrument, producing sounds with it to startle and confuse opponents encountered in forest environments. Despite this behavior being explicitly described in official documentation, Nuzleaf was never given access to the move Grass Whistle in any of the games in which it appeared. The leaf that supposedly served as a musical instrument was never reflected in the movie pool that players actually had access to when raising the creature, and the discrepancy between description and mechanical reality was maintained across every game release without acknowledgement. Shiftry's design drew from the Tengu, the long-nosed mythological beings of Japanese folklore who were said to inhabit mountain forests and possess supernatural awareness of human thought. The ability to read minds was an explicit part of Tengu mythology, as it had been transmitted across centuries of Japanese cultural tradition. And yet, neither Shiftry nor its pre-evolutions could legitimately learn the move Mind Reader at any point in the games where they appeared. The thematic connection was present in every visual element of the design and every layer of the evolutionary concept, but the mechanical connection that would have made the reference complete was never established in any game in any generation. Tylo's Pokédex entries described a creature with practical migratory instincts, slicing through cold seasons and moving toward warmth when temperatures became difficult to endure. The logic of that behavior was consistent with real-world avian migration patterns that the designers had likely observed and incorporated. What made the detail interesting was a contradictory appearance. In Pokémon Park, a Tailo could be found inhabiting the Iceberg Zone, a location defined by cold and frozen environments that seemed directly contrary to every migratory instinct its own Pokédex entries had described. The creature that was supposed to flee cold had been found making its home inside it, and no explanation was given for the inconsistency. Swellow's most memorable anime moment came through an exchange that demonstrated mechanical and narrative awareness at the same time, in a battle that most viewers probably found exciting before they understood why it actually worked. Ash's Pikachu used Thunder on Swellow during a competitive battle, a move that would ordinarily represent a counterproductive choice given Swellow's own typing. The result was that Swellow became paralyzed by the electrical contact, which triggered its Guts ability, which in turn raised its attack stat by 50%. The combination of electrical damage and the body's own response to that damage created a genuine competitive advantage, and the anime's presentation of it suggested a level of mechanical understanding that battle sequences in animated series did not always demonstrate or attempt. Wingull held a distinction that was both simple in nature and quietly remarkable when the implications were considered. Since its introduction to the main series games in Generation 3, Wingull had appeared in every regional Pokédex that had been created without exception. Every generation that produced a regional Pokédex included Wingull somewhere within its listings. The Seagull of Hoenn had become, in its utterly unassuming way, a permanent fixture across the entire history of the franchise's main games, more consistently present than many creatures whose prominence in other media was considerably greater. Pilipper took on a role in Pokémon Journeys that illustrated how these creatures functioned as practical participants in a larger economy. A Pilipper appeared in the series as a carrier for Team Rocket, storing a device called the Rocket Prize Master inside its massive beak pouch and delivering it to Jesse and James when they needed access to random Pokeballs for their schemes. The creature whose entire physical design was built around a carrying pouch, it had become, in the anime's most recent arc, an actual delivery system for another organization's operational equipment. The design purpose had found its narrative application. Ralts introduced a chance encounter that most players moved through without realizing what the moment contained or what was quietly possible within it. During the early sequence of Pokémon Emerald, where Wally caught his first Ralts, the creature he encountered in that scripted sequence had a small but genuine chance of being shiny. Most players experienced the sequence as a tutorial moment, attending to the instructions rather than the Pokémon's coloration. The detail became famous when a competitive speedrunner experienced exactly that outcome during a high-profile run, a shiny Ralts appearing at precisely the moment when the game was being pushed for efficiency rather than exploration, creating a situation where the game's hidden generosity interrupted a performance built entirely on eliminating surprises. Curlia appeared in an anime episode where Meowth's disguise produced a moment of machine clarity over theatrical presentation. The Pokédex consulted during the scene to settle a question about what Meowth actually was beneath his attempted disguise, identified him as a Meowth without hesitation. The device, whose entire function was to identify Pokémon, had simply identified what it saw, regardless of what was layered over it. The scene was brief and played for comedy, but it carried a small observation about the limits of performance when observed by something with no investment in the performance succeeding. Gardevoir's breeding compatibility contained pairings that produced genuine surprise in players who discovered them by exploring the egg group system rather than accepting the visual logic of the design. The creature that represented grace and protective loyalty could breed with Mug, Weezing, Swalot, and Electrode, among others that seemed counterintuitive when placed alongside it. The compatibility chart had been constructed around egg group categories that followed mechanical logic rather than visual or thematic coherence, and Gardevoir's placements within those categories produced combinations that required the underlying system to be understood before the outcomes could be accepted without confusion. Surskit's name carried a linguistic layer entirely invisible to English-speaking players who had never considered that the name might read differently in other languages. In Swedish, the word sur translates to sour, and the word skit translates to something closer to filth or dirt. The combination produced a reading of the Pokémon's name that its Japanese designers almost certainly had not considered or intended. The unintended multilingual meaning became a small piece of trivia circulated among players with the right combination of language backgrounds to discover it naturally. Masquerain carried a particular irony in its relationships to the element its previous evolutionary stage was built on. The creature had evolved from Surskit, a water-type Pokémon whose identity was defined by its relationship to water surfaces and the moisture of its environment. Yet Masquerain's own Pokédex entries noted clearly that it disliked rain and avoided it when possible. The discomfort with the element that had defined its previous existence was written into its character, and the word rain was present in its English name, making the irony visible in the name itself to anyone who paused long enough to notice. Shroomish presented a visual curiosity that required no tools or research to discover, only the thought to look at the design from an unusual angle. The face of Shroomish, when the game sprite was viewed in an inverted position, transformed into something entirely different from the expression the creature normally wore. The design had been structured to hold two visual readings simultaneously, and neither the games nor any official materials drew attention to the alternate reading. The discovery belonged entirely to whoever first had the simple thought to look from a different direction. Breloom's arms carried a capacity for extension that the anime made explicit through comparison with something outside the games entirely. Breloom could reach significantly further than the physical structure of its body suggested was possible, the forearms stretching outward in a manner that evoked the same underlying principle as a certain elastic superhero from popular animation. The comparison was casual and informal, but the underlying mechanical truth it described was genuine and part of the creature's recognized capabilities. Slakoth introduced a design principle through its line that was eventually undermined for exactly one member. Vigoroth, the middle stage that stood between the deeply lazy Slakoth and the enormously powerful Slaking, could not enter the Dream World mechanic at all because its vital spirit ability prevented it from sleeping, which was the required condition for entry. Other Pokémon whose abilities prevented sleep had alternate abilities that could be accessed through the mechanic of ability swapping that some games offered. Vigoroth had no such alternate ability, which left it permanently outside a feature that the rest of its evolutionary line could theoretically access. The most energetic member of a line defined by extremes was excluded from a restful mechanic by the very quality that made it energetic. Slaking found a creative resolution to its most famous limitation in the Pokémon Adventures manga, in a battle format where the limitation became a resource rather than a constraint. Norman's double battle approach is paired Slaking with a Spinda and use skill swap to transfer the Truant ability from Slaking to the Spinda. With Truant removed, Slaking operated without restriction, producing its full output every turn. The Spinda-bearing Truant was considerably less threatening than Slaking would have been with it, and the exchange produced a temporary imbalance that the opponent was not positioned to address. The strategy demonstrated that the right context could transform a defining weakness into a deliberate weapon. Nincada evolved in a way that produced two separate Pokémon simultaneously when a specific condition was present in the player's party. A trainer with an open party slot during the evolutionary moment would find both Ninjask and Shedinja present in their party when the process completed, the vacant space in the roster having been quietly filled by the shed skin becoming its own creature. If the Nincada that evolved had a shiny coloration, both Ninjask and Shedinja shared that coloration, producing two shiny Pokémon from a single evolution. The design of the mechanic was generous in a way that felt almost incidental, though the deliberateness of the system made the generosity intentional. Ninjask's position in Pokémon Ranger as one of the easiest captures in the game created a juxtaposition that became genuinely amusing when the company it kept was examined. The list of Pokémon requiring only a single loop for successful capture included Magikarp, Rattata, Pichu, Goldeen, and Seedot. The swift and technically demanding ninja Pokémon was grouped with creatures better known for being accessible and unthreatening. The mechanical ranking placed them in the same category without regard for the narrative roles they played elsewhere, and the incongruity was one of those details that the game never acknowledged. Shedinja could learn the moves Rest, Substitutes, and Final Gambit despite having only a single hit point available at any moment in its existence. Final Gambit dealt damage equal to the user's current HP total before causing the user to faint, which meant that a Shedinja using Final Gambit would deliver exactly 1 point of damage to an opponent before collapsing. The game's move pool was not designed around the absurdity of this combination, but it was applied with complete consistency, and that consistency occasionally produced outcomes that were valid under the rules while being practically meaningless in any competitive context. Whismur and Loudred held visual details that became minor points of discussion among players who looked at character designs with more attention than the games explicitly invited. The anatomical detail in question was present on both pre-evolutions and absent on Exploud, the fully evolved form, which made the feature consistent across 2 stages and then absent in the third. Exploud offered instead a Pokédex note about its historical role as a long-distance communication tool between cities, its enormous resonating body capable of projecting sound across distances that no voice could manage. The information came from newer game entries and quietly installed a historical purpose into a Pokémon most players thought of primarily in terms of its very loud battle presence. Makuhita's training routine, described in its Pokédex entries, produced an image of disciplined repetition, occasionally interrupted by unexpected consequences. The practice of slapping tree trunks, repeatedly with open hands, was intended to build toughness through accumulated impact, a method consistent with certain real-world martial arts training philosophies. On one notable occasion, recorded in the entries, a Makuhita misjudged the resistance of a particularly solid tree, which happened to be an Exeggutor, and was flung away from the impact. The image was brief and incidental, but it added dimension to a creature whose training regimen might otherwise have seemed purely productive. Hariyama's catch rate produced a mechanical puzzle that resisted easy explanation. The fully evolved form had a catch rate of 200, which represented considerable accessibility, while its pre-evolution Makuhita had a catch rate of 180, which was lower and therefore harder. The usual pattern in Pokemon games moved in the opposite direction, with catch rates decreasing as a creature grew more powerful and more developed. Hariyama inverted that pattern without any official explanation being offered for why a fully evolved fighting-type Pokemon would be easier to catch than the smaller form it grew from. Azurill changed its type between itself and its evolution in a way that created a discontinuity uncommon in the evolutionary system. Before the fairy typing was introduced as a category, Azurill was classified as normal type, while its evolution Marill was water type. Moving from normal to water across a single evolutionary step was unusual enough to attract attention. Some players connected the anomaly to Azurill's lack of arms, suggesting that the design had been conceived to reflect the transition from a creature that could not yet swim to one that was defined by swimming, the typing encoding the developmental gap rather than a stable identity. Nosepass demonstrated its Compass Pokemon identity through a behavior specific to Pokemon Go. When a player ran away from a Nosepass during an encounter in that game, the creature would rotate to face north before the encounter fully closed. The behavior translated an abstract quality from the Pokédex text into a visible action within the game's mechanics, making the compass nature of Nosepass observable in a way that the main series games had never made directly visible. Few connections between lore description and in-game action were as clean or as precise as this one. Skitty found a practical competitive application in an unexpected place, demonstrating that a Pokemon's value was sometimes entirely contextual and dependent on the specific mechanics of the game being played. In the Mystery Dungeon games, specifically the Red and Blue Rescue Team versions, Skitty became the most efficient tool available to speedrunners because its normalize ability gave every move it used the same type attack bonus, regardless of the original type of the move, combined with a move pool that interacted particularly well with the specific mechanics those games used. Double Slap, Attract, and Tail Whip all contributed to the strategy in ways that required understanding how the Mystery Dungeon system processed those moves differently from the main series games. Delcatty and Skitty occupied an unusual position in the franchise's item interaction history that the games never resolved. The two Pokemon evolved through use of the Moonstone, an item whose lunar associations fit the nocturnal and feline qualities of the design. However, the Moon Ball, the Pokeball that provided a catch rate bonus for Pokemon associated with Moonstone evolution, was never available in the same game as either Skitty or Delcatty. In every game where these Pokemon appeared, the Moon Ball did not exist. In every game where the Moon Ball was present, these Pokemon could not be found. The item that should theoretically have been the appropriate tool for capturing them was separated from them by the structure of each game's release, perpetually in the adjacent room. Sablei's Pokédex entries described a dietary preference that contained an irony visible only when cross-referenced with the later generations of Pokémon. The creature ate gemstones as its primary nutritional source, with its particular favorite being the mineral known as carbuncle, a term associated with certain deep red gemstones in geological nomenclature. Carbink, a fairy-type Pokemon introduced in a later generation, was Sablei's only type weakness. The stone that the creature preferred to eat most was of the same type as the only category of attack capable of dealing super effective damage to it. Mawile, with its Mega Evolution, achieved a distinction in effective offensive statistics that no other Pokemon in the roster had managed through any available combination of raw stats and ability. Mega Mawile's base attack stat of 65 was doubled by its huge power ability to a practical application value of 130, and when that value was further modified by favorable conditions, it produced a maximum effective attack power of 678. No other Pokemon, regardless of how dramatically high its printed attack stat appeared, reached an equivalent ceiling under the rules available to players. The creature that looked like a small fairy wearing a large decorative accessory was, under the precise right conditions, the most offensively dangerous Pokémon in the entire competitive game. Heron's cry in the anime bore a sound resemblance to Rhyhorn's cry, close enough that players who had spent considerable times in the games developing familiarity with the audio design noticed and discussed the similarity informally. The two creatures belonged to separate evolutionary lines with no biological relationship, but something in the construction of their sound design placed them in the same auditory register. Aggron, the fully evolved form, carried its own surprise in the move pool. Despite weighing over 800 pounds and carrying a steel and rock dual typing that evoked heaviness and solidity, Aggron could legitimately learn the move Surf. The combination of massive armored dinosaur and smooth ocean travel remained one of the more quietly absurd move pool inclusions in the Hoenn region's catalog. Metatite and Metacum shared a history with the concept of doubled attack power that produced a naming decision that was never officially explained. The huge power ability, which doubled the effective attack stat of any Pokémon that had it, existed as a general mechanic available to multiple Pokémon across the roster. Metatite and Metacum had their own version of the same effect called Pure Power, which functioned in every mechanical respect identically to Huge Power, but existed as a distinct ability under a different name. The reason for maintaining two separate ability names that produced identical outcomes remained unaddressed across every generation in which either creature appeared. Electrike presented a practical hazard that its Pokédex entries conveyed with directness. Using a metal brush on an Electrike during grooming would result in a substantial electrical shock for the person holding the brush, as the charge that accumulated in the creature's fur was large enough to be genuinely dangerous upon contact with a conductive material. The warning implied a specific interaction between the creature's electrical storage and the ordinary tools used to care for Pokémon, suggesting that grooming Electrike required either specialized insulated equipment or a willingness to be periodically shocked. Manectric drew its visual inspiration from the Raiju, a creature from Japanese mythology that was described as taking the shape of various animals while being composed of or accompanied by lightning. The blue wolf, wrapped in white and yellow electrical discharge, was the interpretation the designers chose for Manectric, and the connection to the mythological source was close enough to serve as the primary explanation for the design while still translating the reference into something that felt like a creature rather than a direct depiction. Plusle and Minun were discovered to exist in a specific and unusual dataset from the development of Super Smash Bros. Brawl. The two Pokémon were included in the character selection data files of that game, among a group of 7 characters who had been developed to a sufficient stage of completion to appear in the data, but who were ultimately excluded from the final playable roster. This group became known informally as the Forbidden Seven among players who examined the game's data closely. Plusle and Minun were listed among them under names constructed from the beginnings of their Japanese titles, evidence that at some point during development, the cheerleader Pokémon had been seriously considered as fighters in a competitive platform game. Volbeat's shiny form shared a visual resemblance with Illumis's standard coloration, an overlap between shiny and standard palettes that the two counterpart Pokémon shared with each other. The two Firefly designs were explicitly constructed as visual counterparts, and the palette exchange embedded in their alternate colorations was either a deliberate acknowledgement of their relationship or a coincidence precise enough to feel intentional. The breeding interaction carried its own specificity, and Illumis breeding with a Ditto could produce an egg that hatched into a Volbeat, and the reverse produced the same result in the other direction, making each capable of producing the other through the game's reproductive system. Roselia's Pokédex entries contained a note about variations in flower coloration that players sometimes read as an explanation for the shiny mechanic applied to the creature. Those Pokemon that drank from water with a particularly high nutritional content were said to develop unusually colored blossoms on rare occasions, a naturalistic rationale for why certain Roselia might produce differently colored flowers than the standard variety. The connection between the Pokédex text and the shiny coloration was unofficial and speculative, but the correspondence between the description and the visual outcome was close enough to feel suggestive. Gulpin was not classified as a water type, and the majority of its Pokédex entries focused on its digestive capabilities rather than any aquatic affinity. Despite this, an episode of the Pokémon anime depicted a Gulpin using Water Gun, a move that Gulpin had no legitimate access to within the game's mechanics. The moment passed quickly in the episode, likely unnoticed by most of the viewing audience, but it represented the kind of small inconsistency between the animated series and the game systems that appeared periodically when visual storytelling needs and mechanical accuracy pointed in different directions. Swalot and its pre-evolution shared an item-holding habit that created an ecological question without a direct answer. Both Gulpin and Swalot had a documented chance of being found in the wild while holding a big pearl, an item associated primarily with Shelder, Cloyster, and Clamperl rather than with creatures defined by their capacity to swallow anything they encountered. How these non-aquatic, non-bivalve Pokemon came to be in possession of an item more naturally produced by mollusks was never explained, but the holding rate was real, and the question it raised was genuinely interesting to sit with. Carvanha's physical capabilities, according to its Pokédex entries, included the ability to bite through solid steel with its teeth. A specific Pokémon trading card illustrated this claim directly, showing the creature doing exactly what the text described, which gave the entry a concrete visual companion and made the assertion feel slightly more credible than an unillustrated text claim typically managed. The detail made Carvanha feel threatening in a way that its small size might otherwise have undermined, establishing that the danger it presented was not proportional to its scale. Sharpedo had a moment of historical significance connected to the first public demonstration of Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire for players who had not yet seen the new generation. At the 2002 Pokémon Festa, players were invited to test the games, and the Pokémon assigned to them as their starting creature for those demonstration sessions was Sharpedo rather than any of the game's actual starter options. The choice to use Sharpedo for player introductions suggested that the development team had selected a creature they believed would make an immediate and confident impression on players meeting the new region for the first time, an impression that the Hoenn starters, still unknown, might not yet have been trusted to provide. Wailmer held a format distinction within the Generation 3 card game that was entirely its own among that generation's Pokémon. Among all the creatures from Ruby and Sapphire, Wailmer was the only one to receive an e-reader card, a specialized format that allowed certain game accessories to interact with the cards through optical scanning technology. The card was Rosalind's Wailmer, and its existence as the sole Generation 3 Pokémon in that format made it one of the more obscure collector's items connected to the Hoenn region, a distinction built entirely on uniqueness within a specific product category. Wailord had for a long period held the record as the longest Pokémon in the main series games, a distinction that came with a certain scale and grandeur appropriate to a creature built on the concept of the blue whale. The record was eventually surpassed, and the Pokédex entry in Diamond and Pearl that had described Wailord as the largest Pokémon became factually incorrect once later games introduced creatures with greater measurements. The entry remained in those games as a snapshot of knowledge accurate at a specific moment in the franchise's development, a small historical artifact left unchanged within the text. Numel presented a comparison to Slowpoke that produced a genuinely interesting question about the relative cognitive responsiveness of different Pokémon species. Numel's Pokédex entries described it as a creature that did not notice when it was hit. Slowpoke's entries described it as feeling pain approximately 5 seconds after being struck, which was already notable for its delay. The question of which creature demonstrated a lower awareness of physical events was posed informally in the transcript's source video, and it resisted clean resolution because the entries described extreme insensitivity in different registers that could not be directly compared. Camerupt carried an internal temperature figure that placed it in the same unusual category as Magcargo, a creature from an earlier generation. The magma circulating inside Camerupt's body registered at 18,000 degrees Fahrenheit, according to its entries, a temperature described as twice as hot as the surface of the sun. Magcargo shared a similar figure in its own entries, and the two Pokémon had long served together as examples of the game's willingness to embed physically extraordinary temperature claims into creatures that trainers could handle in battle without consequence. The physics were never reconciled with the world's apparent survivability. Torkoal presented a numerical curiosity in the context of fighting-type Pokémon from the Hoenn generation. There were two Torkoal forms, and both carried a fighting-type designation, which was unexpected for a creature whose design was built around a coal-burning furnace housed in a tortoise shell. The connection between that visual concept and the fighting type required a moment to process, and the designation remained one of those design decisions that was technically present in the data without becoming a commonly discussed piece of the creature's identity. Spoink found a practical application in the Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire pinball games, where its perpetually bouncing body was incorporated as the spring launcher mechanism. The Pokémon, whose entire existence was defined by the inability to stop moving, had been given a functional role that used exactly that defining characteristic as a mechanical component. The design of the application was visually appropriate and slightly absurd, and the game made no particular comment on the repurposing. Spinda held a statistical scope that placed it in a unique position in the roster. The number of distinct patterns available to Spinda was calculated at approximately 4.2 billion, one for each combination of spot positions encoded in the creature's individual personality value. Including the shiny palette for each pattern doubled the total to approximately 8.5 billion distinct possible Spinda appearances. The practical consequence was that the probability of any two encountered Spinda sharing an identical pattern was astronomically small. The chance of meeting an entire horde of shiny Spinda with matching spot configurations was the kind of probability that comparisons to lottery odds genuinely failed to capture in useful terms. Trampinch's Japanese name translated to something with a different emphasis than the English version, capturing a different aspect of the creature's defining physical quality. The translation produced something closer to Nutcracker, focusing on the force and function of the jaw rather than the geological behavior of the antlion that the creature was primarily built on. Both names approached the same design from different angles, and both were valid expressions of a creature defined by what its mouth could do. Vibrava's wings operated at a frequency fast enough to produce physical discomfort in creatures nearby, a fact that was given direct visual representation in the anime when Go attempted to capture one during an encounter. The vibrations produced by the wing movement caused headaches in those nearby, including Ash, making the moment of capture attempt more physically difficult than most episodes acknowledged. The detail grounded Vibrava's aerial nature in something that had real consequences for the characters within the immediate scene. Flygon's mega evolution had a history that belonged not to the development process as usually described, but to a specific human experience within it. The designer assigned to create the Mega Flygon experienced an artist's block during the critical development window for Pokémon X and Y, the period when the concept needed to reach completion before the release schedule could accommodate it. No satisfying design arrived in time, and the Mega Evolution was left out of the final game. The obstacle was not a change in priorities or a strategic shift in game design, but something more personal and more recognizable as a universal creative experience, the moment when the right answer refuses to come, no matter how long one waits for it. Cacnea's proportional relationship between height and weight became one of the more frequently cited examples of physical density in the roster. Standing 1 foot tall and weighing 113 pounds, the creature's mass-to-height ratio placed it among the most densely packed Pokémon in the game, a concentration of weight into a small package that the desert cactus design did not visually suggest. Numbers have a way of revealing things about Pokémon that their appearances rarely prepare the player for. Cacturn's Pokédex entries described a process of biological transformation that took place across geological time, changing the creature's internal chemistry through thousands of years of accumulated desert survival. After that span of adaptation, the substance of Cacturna's blood had shifted to approximate the composition of the sand surrounding it, making the creature, in some fundamental sense, a part of the environment it inhabited rather than simply a creature living within it. The informal description of Cacturn as the Sandman of Pokémon emerged from this detail and had a logic to it that the entry supported. Swablu introduced a type transition that made it unique in the franchise. Its normal and flying typing was visually consistent with its cloud-like appearance and gentle movement style, but it did not hint at what was coming. When Swablu evolved into Altaria, the typing shifted entirely, becoming dragon and flying. This made the Swablu line the only lineage in the main series in which a normal-type Pokémon evolved into a dragon-type final form, a transition between typings that suggested transformation in the most literal sense. Zangoose and Seviper carried their ancient rivalry into the mechanics of Pokémon X and ZY in a way that made the lore visible during actual gameplay. When the player encountered a horde of Zangoose in that game, one member of the horde would always be a Seviper. The Zangoose would not immediately turn their attention to the player. First, they would attempt to eliminate the Seviper in their group, playing out the conflict between the two species as the first order of business before addressing the trainer who had walked into the encounter. The detail was easy to experience without noticing, but once noticed, it recontextualized every future horde encounter involving either species. Despite the depth of their rivalry and the directness of their Pokédex-described enmity, Zangoose and Seviper shared an egg group that made them reproductively compatible with each other. The game held both facts without commentary, presenting the ancient conflict and the biological compatibility simultaneously, and allowing each to remain true without resolving the tension between them. Lunatone's connection to the old man in the Hoenn Desert became one of the more carefully assembled pieces of environmental storytelling across the games that followed Hoenn's era. In Pokémon Sun and Moon, an elderly man sitting quietly in that location would react differently depending on whether a Lunatone or Solrock was present in the player's party. He would recall what seemed like a lost memory, offer an appropriate evolutionary stone, rise from the ground, and ascend into the sky, apparently into space itself. An event distribution that gave players either a Solrock or Lunatone connected to that same location suggested quietly that the old man and one of those creatures had shared something long ago, a story told in implication and item distribution rather than dialogue. Barboach had a scheduled anime debut that was withdrawn before it could air due to circumstances entirely outside the production's control. The episode in question was planned for broadcast in a period following an episode that featured Solrock, but an earthquake struck Japan in the time before the broadcast date, and the producers responded by withdrawing any content featuring moves directly associated with seismic events. Earthquake, fissure, and magnitude were all removed from anime usage as a result, and Barboach's introductory episode was caught in that withdrawal and never broadcast. The moves remained absent from the animated series for years afterward. Whiscash stood as the only Pokémon ever documented as having negated a Master Ball, the item whose entire design purpose was to catch any Pokémon without failure or exception. The Master Ball was described in every game as a tool that could not be resisted, a guarantee of capture given physical form. Whiscash proved that the guarantee was not absolute. The ball was thrown, and it failed, and the creature that caused the failure became one of the few permanent exceptions to an absolute rule. Corphish's Pokédex entries described an origin that placed it outside of Hoenn entirely. The creature had been brought to the region as an imported pet, arriving from somewhere else, rather than evolving locally through the processes that shaped the native species. The entries made clear that Corphish and its evolution were not native Hoenn Pokémon, but offered no specifics about the region of actual origin. The open question of where the line truly came from remained unanswered and became a small invitation to speculation that subsequent games have never formally accepted or closed. Crawdaunt's Dark-type move coverage in the original Hoenn games was limited in a specific and somewhat ironic way for a creature whose design projected aggression and destructive capability. In Ruby and Sapphire, the only damaging Dark-type move available to Crawdaunt through legitimate gameplay was Knockoff. The creature whose visual design emphasized dangerous claws and aquatic predation was restricted to a single Dark-type attacking option, and that option, in the generation it appeared, was not yet the powerful move it would become after future balance changes. Baltoy and Claydol occupied a unique position in the type chart that produced matchups unavailable through any other combination. The Psychic and Ground dual typing was exclusive to their line, meaning that every interaction the type combination created, every resistance, every immunity, every vulnerability was specific to them. Players interested in the abstract logic of type theory occasionally returned to this pairing as an example of how the system could produce unique defensive profiles through combinations that no other Pokémon shared. Claydol appeared in the anime in a version that pushed its design toward genuine danger. An ancient Claydol that had been sealed inside a giant stone Pokeball and awakened after a long dormancy required the combined efforts of multiple trainers and their Pokémon to be contained. The legends that surrounded it described a creature whose power had made it too dangerous for the world it inhabited, sealed away because the world had no better response to what it was capable of. The contrast between the still, hovering creature available in normal gameplay and the awakened ancient presented by the anime was one of those moments where a familiar Pokémon was briefly made to feel genuinely formidable. Lileep and Cradily produced a defensive profile that surprised players who expected a rock and grass combination to be disadvantaged. The two typings individually carried overlapping weaknesses that might have been expected to compound into a very long list of vulnerabilities. Due to the specific way the type chart resolved those overlaps, the actual number of total weaknesses was only 4, fighting Bug, Steel, and Ice. The combination compressed what might have been a long weakness list into something unusually compact for a dual-typed creature. Cradily maintained a visual misdirection about the location of its eyes. The patterns on its forehead were positioned where eyes would be expected and were shaped in a way that supported the assumption. According to the official design documentation, those patterns were not eyes. Cradily's actual visual organs were located in a dark horizontal strip near the base of its head, a position most players never examined closely because the forehead patterns had already resolved the question of where to look. Anorith and Armaldo presented a strange defensive irony in their ability options. Both Pokémon were weak to water-type attacks due to their rock typing. Both could legitimately have Swift Swim as their ability, which increased their speed during rain. Rain in Pokémon battles also increased the power of water-type moves. The conditions that made these creatures faster were the same conditions that made the one category of attack they feared most significantly more powerful. The ability was available, the situation it produced was real, and the game offered no guidance on how to feel about it. Armaldo appeared in a specific game error in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire that players found both unusual and mildly entertaining. The move Slash appeared twice in Armaldo's level up move list. The first instance occurred at level 25, and the second at level 34, both accessible through normal progression. The duplication was present in the game's data, was never corrected through any update or patch, and persisted into the final product. A Pokémon learning the same move twice from its own natural level up sequence was the kind of small error that slipped through a large production without causing any direct gameplay consequence, remaining quietly there for anyone who checked the full list carefully. Phoebus occupied a position in the Generation 3 games that made it genuinely the rarest Pokémon in the region if scarcity was measured by the probability of a random encounter producing one. In Ruby and Sapphire, it appeared in 6 specific water tiles out of 436 total water tiles available across Route 119, with a 50% encounter rate within those specific tiles. On Mount Coronet in the Sinnoh-era games, the situation was slightly more extreme, with 4 specific tiles out of 528 available and the same 50% rate. The combination of a small number of valid tiles, an encounter rate that still offered a chance of no encounter even on a correct tile, and no external indicator of which tiles were valid, made Phoebus uniquely difficult to find through any approach other than systematic searching. Castform's situation with shiny coloration in its weather-altered forms persisted without resolution for an unusually extended period. The creature's ability to change between sunny, rainy, and snowy forms based on the active weather condition during battle was a central part of its design identity, but those alternate forms lacked shiny coloration until a specific Pokémon Go event finally introduced shinies for them. The main series games continued to leave those forms without alternate palettes for far longer than most players would have expected for a Pokémon that had appeared in the franchise for years. Kecleon in the Mystery Dungeon games occupied a position as the most demanding recruitment target in the Red and Blue Rescue Team versions. To have a meaningful chance of recruiting one, the player needed to have their lead Pokémon at level 90 or above, while also carrying a Friend Bow, one of the rarer and more difficult items in the game to obtain consistently. Even with both requirements met, the recruitment rate was 1/10 of a single percentage point, equivalent to 1 success in 1,000 attempts under the best available conditions. The combination of the high-level requirement, the rare item requirement, and the extremely low base rate created a target that most players never successfully recruited. Shuppet had a theory connecting its origin to a specific item found elsewhere in the game's world. The theory proposed that Shuppet was born from resentment, specifically from resentment experienced by a person wearing or possessing a Reaper cloth. The connection between the item associated with ghost-type evolution and the emotional state described in Shuppet's origin created a chain of cause and effect that gave the creature's existence a texture beyond what the Pokédex alone provided. Bennett's entries described an origin in abandonment. A plush doll discarded by a child had developed awareness of what had been done to it, and with that awareness came a specific purpose: to find the child who had thrown it away. The entries stopped there, leaving unanswered what Bennett intended to do upon finding that child. The silence that replaced an answer was more unsettling than most explicit descriptions would have been, and it gave the design a quality of patient, unspecified intention that stayed in the memory of players who read it carefully. Duskull was depicted in a specific Pokémon trading card, in a pose that became a reference point for players who encountered it at the right cultural moment. The physical position the card showed Duskull in bore a close resemblance to the dabbing gesture, popular in a specific period, and whether the pose was deliberately referential or arrived at through independent visual design was never confirmed. The resemblance was close enough to circulate widely. Dusclops carried a shiny coloration that players with familiarity with Japanese folklore recognized as referencing the Chochinobake, a traditional haunted paper lantern from that mythology. The spectral pale appearance of the alternate palette was close enough to the visual language of that folkloric image to read as intentional, giving the shiny form a cultural grounding available to those with the reference to access it. Tropius produced fruits around its neck, and those fruits were specifically the ones the individual creature favored most, according to its Pokédex entries. The generative mechanism that produced fruit at all was the same mechanism that determined which fruit was produced, which meant that the variety growing on any given Tropius was a direct expression of that creature's preferences. The logical extension of that idea, fully consistent with the entry, was that a Tropius with unusual tastes might grow unusual fruit, up to and including varieties like watermelons around its neck, which was as charming and impractical as most applications of Pokédex logic allowed. Kumeko's voice had a structured relationship to music that the design made explicit. The creature could produce 7 distinct cries, and those 7 cries corresponded to the 7 notes of the Western musical scale, A through G. The wind chime Pokémon had a literal correspondence to musical notation built into its sound production, making it one of the few Pokémon whose Pokédex description had direct musical implications for what it would sound like to encounter one in the wild. Absol appeared in locations connected to disaster across multiple games, in ways that accumulated into a consistent pattern when viewed across the franchise's history, rather than within any single game. In Diamond and Pearl, it appeared near the lake where Team Galactic would later attempt to capture Azelf. In Sun and Moon, it appeared near the village Tapu Bulu had destroyed years before. The creature defined as a disaster detector, rather than a disaster cause, maintained its role consistently across games, appearing at the edges of events whose full significance the player would not understand until later in each respective story. Winot could only be encountered on Mirage Island in the original Hoenn games, a location whose appearance depended on a matching hidden value that had a 1 in 10,000 probability of occurring on any given day. The island was not required for any critical gameplay element, offered no story content, and could only be found through persistent daily checking or considerable luck. Players who found it and caught the Winot waiting there had completed something that most trainers who played those games never managed, a discovery whose significance was measured entirely by its difficulty. Snorant appeared in the anime in a role that introduced an unexpected economic consequence of the creature's cultural meaning. The belief that Snorant brought good fortune to any home it visited had made it a target for illegal collection, with poachers capturing them specifically to sell to buyers on the black market who wanted access to the luck the creature supposedly carried. The commercial value placed on a Pokémon because of its association with good fortune created the very danger that threatened it, a quiet irony embedded in a subplot that the anime handled with more ethical texture than many episodes attempted. Glally, whose entire visible face was a giant mouth surrounded by dark matter, could not learn the move Lick. Smooshum, a creature defined by its relationship to kissing and oral expression, could learn Lick without difficulty. The gap between Glally's appearance and its permitted move pool was one of those small internal contradictions that the system occasionally produced. A face that was nothing but mouth, unable to use the move that required a mouth, while a small creature whose defining feature was its lips had access without restriction. Cialio's documented habit of balancing things on its nose extended in the entries to include its own pre-evolution spiel, establishing a playful continuity through the evolutionary line. The image of a creature balanced carefully on the nose of its larger evolutionary successor was one of those design details that made the developmental stages feel connected through behavior rather than just through visual progression. Walrein and the creatures in its line possessed a type combination and ability pairing that produced a resistance to ice-type attacks 8 times stronger than standard. The water and ice dual typing, combined with the thick fat ability, created a defensive profile against ice that meant the Pokémon built on cold and icy design was one of the most resistant creatures in the game to the attacks associated with those elements. The design turned its own elemental identity into its strongest protection, which felt both logical and unexpected at the same time. Clamprel's pearls were described in the entries as potentially exceeding in value the pearls produced by Shelder by a factor of 10 or more. The economic figures in those entries had reasonable correspondence to the in-game selling prices for the Pearl and Big Pearl items available to players, suggesting that the fictional economy implied by the Pokédex text was at least loosely reflected in the practical item values available during normal gameplay. Huntail and Gorobis were given a social dimension in the anime that went beyond their status as version-exclusive evolutions of the same creature. Their respective fans were given separate geographic homes, residing on different islands and maintaining the competitive appreciation for their chosen Pokémon in a way that made the rivalry between version exclusives into a community rather than just a game mechanic. The detail was specific enough to feel like it existed in a world with real social geography. Gorobis shared a feeding behavior with Beautifully that was described in language considerably more direct than most Pokédex entries used when addressing predation. Both Pokémon stabbed into prey with long, narrow mouths and drained fluids. What distinguished Gorobis was the described method of inserting its mouth into the mouth of the prey before feeding, a technique described plainly and without framing. The description gave Gorobis a quality of quiet menace that its graceful design and elegantly curved form did not project without the text to accompany it. Relicanth's entries positioned it as biological proof that evolutionary perfection was an achievable state. Having remained unchanged for 100 million years, it was described as a Pokémon that natural selection had simply found nothing to improve, a creature so well suited to its environment and its way of living that time had no leverage on its form. The comparison to the coelacanth, the real fish that shares the same claim to biological persistence, was the foundation of the design, and the game expressed that foundation through its entries with the same directness the fossil fish carries in its own scientific description. Luvdisk presented one of the stranger competitive outcomes in the anime's Hoenn arc. The statistical profile of Luvdisk was among the weakest of any fully evolved Pokémon, with nearly every stat except speed well below average for creatures at that developmental stage. Gym leader Hoenn used a Luvdisk against Ash's Grovyle in a battle that Luvdisk won despite the type disadvantage and the statistical gap. The outcome was presented as testimony to what an expert trainer could accomplish with a Pokémon that most observers would have dismissed before the battle began, a quiet argument for the irrelevance of statistics when skill and preparation were sufficient. Bagon's skull had been hardened through accumulated impact rather than through any biological intent. The desire to fly was genuine and overwhelming, and the response to that desire was to repeatedly throw the body from high places and wait for the result. Hundreds or thousands of such attempts produced a head that had become, through consequence rather than design, an extraordinary natural helmet. The rock head ability, which Baekjin could legitimately carry, prevented recoil damage, a mechanical reflection of what all those cliff-leaping attempts had actually built. Shelgon existed in Drake's party at a level 2 points past the point at which it should have evolved. Drake was an Elite Four member whose entire team was built on Dragon-type Pokémon, and his Shelgon was level 52. Shelgon evolved into Salamence at level 50. The game did not comment on this. Drake did not comment on this. The creature simply existed at that level in that party, a quiet technical contradiction between evolutionary mechanics and the roster of one of the game's final challenges. Salamence's appearance in the Pokémon Adventures manga left a physical consequence that ran through the entire Hoenn arc. The attack on young Ruby and Sapphire by a wild Salamence left Ruby with a scar on his face, and every hat Ruby wore throughout the manga's Hoenn storyline was a deliberate concealment of that scar. The creature that had attacked in that early moment was responsible for one of the most consistent visual elements across the entire story's protagonist, making a single encounter the origin of a visual detail maintained for hundreds of chapters. Beldoom's catch rate of 3 placed it in the company of legendary and mythical Pokémon, the creatures defined by their rarity and power within the narrative logic of the games. The same number that described the difficulty of catching a Mewtwo or a Rayquaza was the number assigned to the smallest and least impressive-looking member of the Metagross family. The equivalence was mechanical rather than narrative, but it made the act of catching a Beldum feel as significant as the number suggested. Metagross was the assembled product of a process of fusion that the Pokédex described across multiple evolutionary stages. 2 Beldum fused to form a Metang. 2 Metang fused to form a Metagross. The creature described as the supercomputer Pokémon was structurally the combination of 4 individual Beldum, each pair having merged and merged again until the final form held all 4 within its structure. The complexity of what Metagross was made of gave the design a depth that its visual representation as a large metallic cross suggested but did not fully convey. Metagross had accumulated the most shiny appearances in the Pokémon anime, among any creature whose shiny coloration had been seen by viewers. A wild, shiny Metagross appeared in an episode set in an unusual environment, and Steven Stone's own Metagross appeared in its shiny form during the Mega Evolution Special, producing at least 2 distinct confirmed appearances of the gold-toned variant. The particular quality of Metagross's shiny palette made each appearance visually distinctive enough to be remembered independently. Regirock's in-game footprint carried a visual reference to the scarab, the dung beetle regarded as sacred in ancient Egyptian culture for its association with the sun's movement across the sky. The scarab had been used for thousands of years as a symbol of protection, renewal, and divine attention. Finding that image embedded in the footprint of an ancient stone golem that had been sealed away in a hidden chamber connected the design to a real-world tradition of sacred prehistoric significance, a connection the official materials never explicitly confirmed, but that the visual correspondence made difficult to read as accidental. Regis in the Heart Gold and Soul Silver games exhibited a small behavioral response when it made contact with ice, appearing surprised or startled by the encounter. The golem, whose entire body was composed of Antarctic ice, accumulated over an indeterminate period, was apparently still capable of being caught off guard by contact with the element that formed its entire physical being. The animation or behavior prompt that produced this description was small, but it circulated among players who had spent time observing the Regitrio's responses with the attention that small details required. Registeel's cry in the anime carried a sound quality that listeners compared to a DJ turntable with enough consistency that the comparison became part of the creature's informal, descriptive vocabulary. The mechanical qualities of the cry, its rhythm and texture, and the electronic scraping quality it projected supported the comparison better than most informal sonic descriptions hold up to repeated listening. Latias was one of 2 Pokémon across the entire animated series described as having developed a romantic attachment to Ash. The kiss Latias gave Ash, While disguised as the human character, Bianca became one of the more discussed moments in the franchise's animated history, not because of what it meant precisely, but because of what it left unclear. The moment was gentle and brief, and the camera moved on from it before its full implications could be addressed, which was exactly the kind of restraint that made it persist in the memory of viewers who encountered it. Latios and Latias were described in their entries as flying faster than jet aircraft, a comparison that established their aerial position at the upper end of what the game world's physics could express. Purugly, a cat Pokémon from a later generation, not particularly associated with speed or aerodynamic excellence, had a base speed stat that exceeded both Latios and Latias under standard battle conditions. The legendary duo that was supposed to resemble jets and outpace them was outrun by a cat whose entry in the Pokédex emphasized its size and its tendency to force smaller Pokémon out of their nests rather than its velocity. Primal Kyogre was depicted in Pokémon generations entering the sky, rather than remaining in the ocean, where its design and lore placed it. Hovering in the atmosphere above a tsunami it had generated, the creature's capabilities in that short animated sequence extended well beyond the aquatic domain that defined its standard identity, suggesting that Primal Kyogre's full range of capabilities was not fully expressed in the game's mechanics, and that the gap between depicted power and available moves was significant. Groudon's height was 11 feet and 6 inches, which placed it at the same measurement as Arbok, a large cobra Pokémon. The pairing was cited as one of the cleaner examples of unexpected proportional equivalence in the franchise, though the weight and mass and narrative significance of Groudon placed it in a very different practical category. The height number was real, and Arbok was genuinely the same height, and neither the game nor its documentation acknowledged the coincidence. Mega Rayquaza possessed a catch rate higher than that of Mantike, a baby water and flying Pokémon introduced as a pre-evolution for Mantine. Mantike was small, accessible, and obtainable in normal gameplay without any particular effort or circumstance. Mega Rayquaza required specific conditions to encounter and was one of the strongest battle entities available in its generation. The catch rate, which was a number assigned to reflect difficulty of capture, had been set in a way that made the apex predator of the sky technically easier to catch than a small fish Pokémon that most trainers barely thought about. Jirachi's design was built around a Japanese cultural festival in a way that made each element of the creature's identity correspond to something specific from that tradition. The Tanzaku, the paper slips used to write wishes during the Tanabata Star Festival, appeared as the 3 strips on Jirachi's head. Tanabata was observed on the 7th day of the 7th month. Jirachi awoke for 7 days at a time. Each component of the creature's design and behavioral rules connected to the same festival and the same calendar logic, making Jirachi one of the most internally consistent mythological references in the franchise's design vocabulary. Deoxys occupied a particular position in the timeline of its own introduction that placed it in a game it was not from before it appeared in the game it was classified as belonging to. As a Hoenn Pokémon, its expected debut was in one of the Hoenn games. It was instead distributed through Fire Red and Leaf Green, the Kanto remakes released in the same hardware generation, as an event Pokémon made available on August 31st of 2004, 2.5 weeks before Pokémon Emerald's release. The Pokémon that was categorized as a Hoenn native reached the hands of players through a Kanto game before the Hoenn game it was associated with had reached any player at all. Trico's old companion in the anime, the creature that lingered beside a dying tree long after the rest of its kind had moved on, was a fact about loyalty expressed through behavior rather than words. The game never needed to say anything directly about what it meant to stay with a place that was no longer providing what it once provided. The old Trico demonstrated it through action, and the demonstration was more complete than a Pokédex entry could have managed. The anime had that particular freedom, the freedom to show duration, to let a creature stand beside something and persist beside it, and the scene used that freedom with restraint. The way Ash's Trico learned Bullet Seed through observation had a different quality, one that connected learning to watching rather than to instruction. A Pokémon sees something done, processes the mechanics of it, and then does it. The games implied this process through the move tutor mechanic, through the experience of leveling up, through the concept of the TM. The anime made it visible in a way that felt grounded and specific, a particular Pokémon watching a particular action and finding its own way to perform it shortly after. The watermelon seeds were a prop and a teaching device and a visual metaphor for how knowledge transferred across species, all at once. Sceptile's tail launch was a design built on real biomechanics, translated into something capable of performing in a battle system. Real lizards use their tails in exactly the way the move depicted, sometimes deliberately, sometimes as reflex response to threat. The translation from real animal behavior to game mechanic was one of the cleaner ones in the region, a case where the biological source and the game application were close enough to each other that understanding one enriched understanding of the other rather than requiring them to be held separately. Torchic's black marking was perhaps the most deeply contextual of the early facts, requiring knowledge of a specific agricultural practice from a specific country in a specific century to fully appreciate. The designers did not assume that everyone who played the game would have that knowledge. They embedded the detail knowing that most players would not register it as anything more than a subtle design choice. The detail existed for the players who would understand it eventually, whenever that happened to be, not because it was hidden exactly, but because it was encoded in a language that required a particular kind of literacy to read. Combusken's shiny form restoration was a case of quiet correction. 15 years was a very long time for something to persist in an altered state, and the restoration, when it came, was done without drama. The change was made, the earlier version ceased to be the current version, and the creatures that players had caught in the intervening years continued to carry the coloration they had been given. The history of those shinies was preserved in the creatures that held it, even after the source of the variation had been corrected. There was something almost archival about that, the persistent record of an error encoded in the creatures that existed before it was fixed. Blaziken's design origins were unusual in the specificity of the comparison that was reportedly explored. Latias was a sleek, aerodynamic creature built for flight, and the combination of that visual language with a fire-type fighting bird was a pairing that the final design did not carry forward. The early Blaziken was not the Blaziken that players came to know. There were sketches, directions considered and set aside, prototypes that exist only in the documentation of what was tried before the final form was established. Every Pokémon design began as a collection of possibilities, and the ones that were set aside were as much a part of the design's history as the one that was kept. The giant mudkips in the anime presented a narrative logic question that the games and the anime each resolved differently because they were operating from different sets of priorities. The games needed Mudkip as a small, charming starter whose appeal was immediate and whose combat potential grew gradually over time. The anime needed narrative content, dramatic moments, creatures behaving in ways that created story. The giant mudkips guarding their nests served the anime's needs, and the ecological question that created could be set aside in favor of the moment the scene was building toward. The games and the anime shared a name and a design and a basic concept, and they diverged wherever the needs of their respective formats required them to. Marshtomp's expression became a small cultural moment when the official account acknowledged it. The acknowledgement was brief and humorous and quickly passed, but it represented the franchise's willingness to look at its own work with a degree of self-awareness that larger and more corporate presentations of popular intellectual property sometimes declined to perform. The Pokémon team knew what Marshtomp looked like. They had always known. The moment of saying so publicly was a small gift to the community that had been saying it for years. Swampert's 566 million damage calculation existed at the intersection of the game's rules and a set of conditions that no competitive player would construct casually. The conditions required specific items, specific abilities, specific move sequences, specific type interactions, and specific support from other Pokémon that were themselves built around enabling the calculation rather than contributing to it independently. The number was real in the sense that the game's own math produced it when the conditions were met. It was the game's internal logic extended to its own extreme. The rules applied fully and without exception until they produced a result that no one would ever encounter in ordinary play. Zigzagoon's role in Emerald's opening was a design decision about the nature of beginnings. A story that began with failure, with the player's starter being knocked out in the very first encounter, would have established a tone that the game was not built to sustain. The protective measure, the Zigzagoon that retreated rather than finishing the battle, ensured that the opening moment remained one of rescue and connection rather than defeat. The game protected the first feeling it gave to new players, and in doing so protected the start of what it hoped would be a relationship between the player and the game lasting many hours. Lanoon's Pokédex description of right-angle turning was one of those entries where the promise made in text was eventually honored in visible behavior, years after the text was written. The gap between a description and its visual realization was common in Pokémon, where the Pokédex often described things that the game's graphical limitations could not show. When Sword and Shield introduced overworld Pokémon encounters, many of those long-standing descriptions finally had the visual context they had always implied. Hoenn was among the most satisfying of those realizations, because its movement pattern was specific enough to be immediately recognizable when seen. Wurmple's hidden personality value was a design decision about the relationship between player agency and game outcome. Most Pokémon games gave players significant control over their team's development, offering choices about moves, held items, training locations, and battle strategies. Wurmple's evolution removed that control entirely from a specific decision, making the outcome purely a matter of what the game had already decided. The experience of not knowing, of watching a Wurmple level and wondering which path it would take, was a texture of uncertainty that the game produced deliberately by making the determining factor invisible. Players who understood the mechanic still couldn't change the outcome. Understanding was not the same as control. Silcoon's use of soap on bark during its waiting period added a small detail of maintenance to a stage that otherwise represented total suspension. The choice to give Silcoon something to do during its cocoon period, even something as small as cleaning, made the developmental pause feel less like absence and more like preparation. The creature was not simply waiting. It was maintaining itself in the interval between what it had been and what it would become, and the soap was a small expression of that maintenance instinct. Beautifully's predatory behavior operated as a structural contrast with its visual design, the kind of contrast that the franchise used most effectively when it was applied with restraint. The beauty was real. The predation was real. Neither canceled the other. The creature that looked like a graceful butterfly was also a creature that fed in a specific and clinical way, and the coexistence of those facts was more interesting than either fact alone. Design that held tension without resolving it tended to stay in the memory longer than design that resolved cleanly into a single quality. Cascoon's patience was a different kind of design about waiting, one with an orientation toward the future rather than the present. The waiting that Silcoon performed was about maintenance. The waiting that Cascoon performed was about memory, about the accumulation of what had been done to it, and the intention to respond to that when the capacity to respond became available. The Pokédex was describing, in the compact language of its entries, a creature with something that functioned like grievance, something that connected present suffering to future action through a persistent internal record. It was a small and specific kind of characterization, and the fact that it lived in a Pokédex entry, rather than in a cutscene or a dialogue, gave it a quality of casual authority that more formal narrative presentations rarely achieved. Dustox's poison status pathway was one of those technical details that existed primarily because the game's rules were applied consistently, rather than because anyone had designed it as a feature. The rules for how Cascoon's typing and evolutionary mechanics interacted created a pathway, and the rules were applied to that pathway the same way they were applied everywhere else, producing a result that was technically valid and practically unnoticed by nearly every player who ever raised the line. The game's consistency was the source of the detail, and consistency occasionally produced outcomes that were interesting precisely because they were unintentional. Lotad's role as carrier connected the design to a broader tradition of gentle helpers in these games, Pokémon whose purpose in the world was fundamentally cooperative. The design did not make Lotad powerful or threatening. It made it useful in a specific way, capable of serving a function for other creatures that needed something it could provide. The parallel to Lapras was informal but accurate, both creatures defined by their willingness to carry others across water, both occupying a position in the game world that was less about battle capability and more about movement and passage. Lombre's Chinese name was one of those translation artifacts that revealed how much meaning a name could carry without the player ever seeing the translation. The name Lotus Hat Lad captured three things: the plant material, the visual design, and the approximate developmental stage of the creature, all in 3 syllables. Names in Chinese could carry that kind of density more easily than names in English or Japanese, because the characters used to write them carried semantic content that phonetic alphabets could not embed. The English name Lombre communicated less directly, but the Chinese name was a small, complete description. Ludicolo's music-powered biology was a lore detail whose full implications were most visible in a game outside the main series, in a context that required players to have read the Pokédex entries for a Pokémon that was not part of their own team. Mirror B's decision to use a festive theme against trainers who might be facing Ludicolos was within the logic of the lore, a tactical choice as much as a character expression. Whether the developers intended the connection or whether it was a fortunate coincidence was not determinable from the games alone, but the connection existed and rewarded the players who made it. Seedout's daily routine of hanging from branches and absorbing moisture was the kind of small ecological behavior that made the game world feel inhabited. It was not a dramatic behavior. It was not a behavior that showed up in battle or in story. It was simply something Seedout did, a daily necessity expressed through a body design that was suited to it. The more luminous Seedout became as it fed, the more it resembled its evolution in some ways, a slight brightening of the surface that connected the daily behavior to the developmental arc. Nuzleaf's inability to learn Grass Whistle, despite the explicit Pokédex description of it, using its leaf as a flute, was the kind of oversight that accumulated in the move pools of many Pokémon across many generations. The move pool and the Pokédex entries were developed by different teams at different points in the process, and they did not always align. The entry described the behavior as real, as an actual capability that Nuzleaf used in the wild. The move pool simply did not include the move that would have made that capability mechanically real. The gap between them was maintained across every subsequent game release, each of which had the opportunity to correct it, and none of which did. Shiftry's Tengu lineage was among the most clearly traced of Hoenn's folkloric references. The design carried every significant element of the Tengu's visual vocabulary: the long nose, the fan made of feathers, the supernatural association with mountain forests, the capacity for reading minds. The last element was there in the folklore, but absent from the mechanical move pool, which created a gap between what the creature was supposed to be capable of and what players could actually do with it. The gap was not a mistake exactly, more a case of the design narrative and the game mechanics having been developed with different information about each other. Tailow's presence in the iceberg zone was a small inconsistency that existed in a franchise that had many small inconsistencies, where the lore description of a Pokemon's behavior and the actual locations where it appeared in various games were determined by different people for different reasons. The Pokédex described migratory instincts. The game designers needed a roster of creatures for each area that served the design needs of that area. Taillow in the cold zone was a decision made for practical reasons, and the lore reason for its presence was simply left unaddressed. Swellow's Thunder Armor moment in the anime was one of the cleaner examples of the animated series, using the game's mechanical logic to construct a dramatic outcome. The Guts ability was a real mechanic. Paralysis was a real status. The 50% attack increase was real. What the anime did was dramatize a sequence of events that any player with sufficient mechanical knowledge could have constructed in theory, giving those players the satisfaction of seeing something they understood turn into something narratively significant. The moment worked because the underlying logic was sound, not despite it. Wingull's presence in every regional Pokédex was the kind of consistency that could only be noticed after the fact, after enough games had been released and enough Pokédex lists had been compiled to reveal the pattern. No single game made Wingull's inclusion obvious as a fact about the franchise. The fact only became visible when the games were viewed as a collection, when the pattern across them could be traced. Wingull was in every list, not because any single game demanded it, but because each game chose to include it, and every game made the same choice. Pelipper's delivery role in Journeys completed a design circle that the creature's visual design had always implied. The pouch that defined Pelipper's visual identity was always going to be a storage container in some context. The anime had used it for carrying small Pokémon, for delivering supplies, for various purposes across its many episodes. The Rocket Prize Master was simply the most recent application, and the application served the narrative need of the moment while being visually continuous with everything Pelipper had been used for before. Ralts in Wally's scripted encounter was a hidden opportunity embedded inside a tutorial moment, a design decision that gave the sequence additional depth without making that depth visible or necessary to anyone who didn't know to look for it. The possibility of a shiny Ralts was probably not the designer's primary intention for the scene. It may have been a consequence of using the standard encounter system for what felt like a scripted moment, a decision made early in development that remained in the game simply because there was no compelling reason to remove the possibility. When it happened to a speedrunner, the coincidence of a shiny appearing at the moment of maximum efficiency felt like the game's sense of humor. Kirlia's Pokédex-assisted identity reveal in the anime was a small meditation on how recognition worked. Meowth could perform the disguise convincingly enough to be visually indistinguishable from Kirlia, apparently. But the Pokédex, operating on whatever identification system it used, looked past the visual performance and identified what was actually there. The scene was funny, and it was also quietly accurate about how identification devices tended to work. They didn't care about performance, only about what the system was designed to detect. Gardevoir's egg group placements illustrated one of the fundamental tensions in Pokemon's biological design, which was that the systems were built for mechanical balance and variety rather than for visual or thematic coherence. Players who constructed their understanding of Pokemon biology from appearance and character were regularly surprised by the compatibility chart, which was built on categories that crossed thematic lines in ways that appearance-based thinking could not predict. Gardevoir breeding with Electrode was not a biological claim about the natural world. It was a mechanical consequence of the category systems that the game used to organize Pokemon reproduction. Sursket's Swedish misreading was the kind of multilingual accident that the internet made visible in ways that would never have circulated in the pre-internet era of the games. Before global communities formed around these games, players in different countries experienced them in relative isolation. The accidental meaning of a name in another language was a local piece of trivia known to some players in one country and unknown to players everywhere else. The internet changed that, making the trivia global, allowing any player anywhere to encounter it regardless of their language background. Mascarin's rain aversion was a design decision that prioritized character expression over biological consistency. The creature had come from Surskit, had grown up on water, had spent its early developmental stage associated with moisture, and then it disliked rain. The decision to give the evolved form an aversion to the element its predecessor was built on created a small personality trait through biological contrast, a creature that had moved away from what it had been and carried that distance in its behavior. Shroomis's inverted face was a design secret that required no knowledge of the game's mechanics or lore to discover, only a moment of curiosity about what things looked like from a different direction. The availability of that discovery to anyone at any time without any prerequisite made it a more democratic kind of secret than most game facts, which required either research or mechanical knowledge or both. Anyone who thought to look could find it. Not everyone thought to look. Breloom's arm extension brought an animation principle into the game world. The idea that a body could reach further than its structure implied was a visual shorthand for power and surprise in animation, used in various contexts to convey that a character's capabilities exceeded their apparent physical form. Breloom's design used this principle within the constraints of the game's visual system, and the anime made it explicit through a comparison that translated the game's implication into something visible and directly stated. Slakoth in its evolutionary line represented a design experiment in extremes. The line contained the slowest, fully evolved, non-legendary Pokemon in terms of behavioral engagement, Slaking with its truant ability, and the most energetic middle stage, Vigoroth, which expressed its energy through its inability to perform any other state. The design explored what a line looked like when its stages were not simply increases in capability, but actual changes in fundamental behavioral orientation, from deep lethargy to explosive energy to the contained enormity of Slaking, which was lethargic not because it lacked power, but because it possessed too much to spend on constant activity. Ninkata's split evolution was mechanically unusual in ways that still attracted interest from players encountering it for the first time. The idea that a single Pokemon's evolution could produce two Pokemon simultaneously, that the shed shell could become its own creature, that the evolution could fill a vacant party slot with something real, was the kind of mechanic that felt like it belonged to a different kind of game. It worked within the game's rules, and the rules were applied consistently, but the outcome felt like a surprise every time, even for players who knew it was coming. Ninjask's ease of capture in Pokemon Ranger was a reminder that mechanical difficulty was always relative to the system being used. In the main series games, Ninjask was fast, difficult to catch effectively, and defined by its speed. In Ranger, the capture system used loot mechanics that rewarded different things, and the Pokémon that was challenging in one context was trivially accessible in the other. The same creature occupied different positions in different games' difficulty hierarchies because difficulty was a function of the specific system being tested, not a fixed property of the creature itself. Shedinja's relationship with Final Gambit was a perfect example of the game applying rules without exception. Final Gambit was designed to deal damage equal to the user's HP. Shedinja had 1 HP. 1 HP was the number used in the calculation. The result was valid, and the result was exactly 1 damage. The game did not add a note that the combination was pointless. It did not flag Shedinja as an exception to Final Gambit's mechanics. It simply calculated the result and produced it, and the result was simultaneously technically valid and practically useless, which was its own kind of perfection. Wismur and Loudred's anatomical details were noticed more readily in an era of sprites and low-resolution graphics, when designs were smaller and details were harder to distinguish. As the games moved to higher resolutions and three-dimensional models, the details that had been present but small became clearer and more visible, and conversations about them became more common. The details had always been there. The clarity of their visibility changed over time as the technology improved and the designs were rendered at larger scales. Xbloud's historical communication role gave the evolutionary line a narrative function across time that battle statistics alone could not provide. The idea that Xbloud had served as an infrastructure tool, a means by which distant communities maintained contact before other technologies were available, connected the design to a world that existed before the present day of the games. The entry gave Xbloud a past, and a past gave the creature a dimension that purely functional descriptions could not produce. Makuhita and the Executor incident was a small story about the gap between training intention and real-world consequence. The practice of building toughness through repeated impact was a legitimate physical discipline. The failure to account for a tree that could push back was the kind of error that the Pokédex entry described with a dry specificity that made the scene easy to picture. Makuhita, flying through the air after misjudging the resistance of a living tree, was a very specific image of a very specific miscalculation, and the specificity made it more memorable than a general statement about training difficulty would have been. Hariyama's inverted catch rate was perhaps the most practically strange of all the mechanical details in the Hoenn region. Players who understood catch rates knew to expect difficulty in catching evolved forms, to feel the resistance of a higher stage Pokémon against the ball that was thrown at it. Hariyama simply did not behave the way that expectation predicted. The evolved form gave way more readily than the pre-evolution had. The game had its reasons, encoded somewhere in the data, and those reasons were never publicly explained, and the inconsistency remained. Azural's type change was one of the few cases in the franchise where evolving a Pokémon changed its defensive profile in a way that could affect how it interacted with type matchups during battle. In generations where Azurill and Marill could both be present in a team in some form, the switch from normal to water that happened at evolution changed what moves threatened the creature and what moves it resisted. The transition was unusual enough to be worth noting, and the design rationale of encoding the creature's developmental state in its typing was a thoughtful use of the type system for characterization rather than purely for mechanical balance. Nosepass and its compass behavior in Pokémon Go was one of the cleaner translations of Pokédex lore into interactive behavior across any game in the franchise. The text had always said the creature faced north. The game made that text visible as a real behavior. The connection between the Pokédex as documentation and the game as demonstration was made explicit in a way that rewarded players who had read the text and wondered whether it would ever be made real. Skitty's Mystery Dungeon Roll was a case study in the way specialized knowledge about a specific game's mechanics could transform a Pokemon's perceived value entirely. Players who knew Skitty from the main series games knew it as a normal type with modest stats and a pleasant design, a Pokemon whose appeal was primarily aesthetic. Players who understood the Red and Blue Rescue Team systems knew it as the most efficient tool available for a specific form of competitive play. The Pokemon was the same. The knowledge required to use it differently was what changed. Delcatty and Skitty's Moonball situation was a case of systemic misalignment that persisted because nothing about it caused any practical problem for players. The Moonball could not be used on the Pokemon it should theoretically have applied to, because the game releases where those Pokemon appeared and the game releases where the Moonball appeared never coincided. Players who wanted the bonus the Moonball was supposed to provide could not access it for these Pokemon. They could catch them in other balls. The absence of the Moonball was never an obstacle to catching them, only an absence of the specific bonus the system implied they should have access to. Sableye's dietary irony was one of those design details that became richer when later generations added the context that made the irony visible. When Sableye appeared in the original games, the detail about preferring carbuncle gemstones was interesting in itself but did not carry any additional implication. When Carbink appeared in a later generation as a fairy type and Sableye's only weakness, the detail accumulated a layer of meaning it had not previously had. The design connection between predator and weakness was not created at the time Sableye was designed. It was created retroactively by the introduction of Carbink, and then projected backward onto the Sableye entry to produce the irony that was not originally there. Mega Mawil's position at the top of effective attack calculations was a case of design interaction producing an outcome more powerful than any of the individual components suggested when viewed separately. The base stat was modest. The ability's effect was substantial, but not unprecedented. The combination of both, under the right conditions, produced a ceiling that exceeded everything else available, a result of the system's internal logic, rather than a deliberate decision to make Mega Mawile specifically the most powerful. The result simply emerged from the interaction of the design elements that were already present. Aaron's Cry similarity to Rhyhorn's was the kind of audio design relationship that players constructed informally without any official confirmation that the similarity was intentional. The sound design teams for these games worked on large numbers of creatures simultaneously, and whether a given cry resemblance was intended as a thematic connection or was simply a coincidence of the creative process producing two results in similar registers was rarely clarified. The informal connection became real in the communities that discussed it, regardless of its origin. Metatite and Medicham's pure power situation was never explained because the game's documentation did not address it directly. The mechanical consequence of the two ability names was identical. The names themselves were different. Whether pure power and huge power were intended to be separate abilities for lore reasons, whether the line between them was intended to suggest something about the nature of each creature's power source, or whether the distinction was simply an artifact of how the abilities were implemented in the code, was not publicly stated. Players constructed various explanations, but none of them were confirmed. Electrike's Metal Brush Hazard was a fact that lived in the space between the Pokémon world and practical advice. The world of these games contained Pokémon grooming centers, contests where condition was judged, and detailed systems for improving a Pokemon's contest statistics through careful care. The warning about Electrike's charge was Pokemon grooming advice, delivered through Pokédex text. a small practical caution embedded in a world where the practical implications of Pokemon care were rarely examined in such specific terms. Manectric's Raiju origin was a design connection that became more interesting when placed alongside other mythologically sourced designs in the same region. Hoenn contained a number of designs drawn directly from specific creatures in Japanese and international folklore, each of them translated with varying degrees of fidelity. Manectric was among the more direct translations, the visual language of the design close enough to the mythological source that players with familiarity with the Raiju would recognize the connection immediately. The blue wolf wrapped in lightning was the image the mythology provided, and the design kept the essential elements intact. Plusle and Minun in the Forbidden Seven were witnesses to a history of Super Smash Bros. Development that most players of that franchise were not aware of before the data became public. The existence of the 7 unused characters in the game's files told a story about decisions made and reversed during development, about designs that reached a sufficient level of completion to be listed, but not a sufficient level to be released. Plusle and Minun's presence among them placed the 2 cheerleader Pokémon in a history they had not knowingly participated in, at least not in any form that players ever experienced directly. Volbeat and Illumis's palette relationship was a detail that rewarded players who looked at both creatures' alternate colorations at the same time rather than examining each in isolation. The individual shinies were each interesting. The relationship between them, visible only when both were considered simultaneously, was a different kind of detail, one that existed in the space between 2 Pokémon rather than within either of them. The franchise occasionally placed meaning in those relational spaces, and the Firefly pair was one of the cleaner examples of it. Roselia's nutritionally rich spring water bloom was a detail that the Pokédex offered as a natural phenomenon, a consequence of environmental quality expressed in flower coloration. Players who connected the description to the shiny mechanic were doing something that the game did not ask them to do, constructing an explanation for a mechanical feature from lore text that was not written to explain it. But the connection was available and satisfying when made, which was its own kind of design success. Gulpin's anime water gun was one of many small moments where the animated series diverged from the game mechanics without comment or justification, simply proceeding with what served the scene. The inconsistency existed, and no one watching for the first time would have noticed it unless they happened to remember the move pool details for a Pokémon that most players did not think about carefully. The divergence was small enough to pass invisibly in the flow of the episode and significant enough to be interesting in retrospect. Swalot and Gulpin holding big pearls in the wild was a loot table decision that placed certain items in hands that the items association did not predict. Pearl items came from Pokémon associated with producing pearls, and Swalot and Gulpin were associated with swallowing things indiscriminately. The combination suggested that somewhere in the wild, a Gulpin had swallowed something that produced a big pearl before being caught, and that the contents of the encounter reflected that. The loot table was not wrong exactly. It simply produced an image that required creative interpretation to explain. Carvanha's steel-chewing capability was a design decision about the creature's position on the threat hierarchy that its size did not obviously support. Carvanha was small. Its design implied aggressiveness in facial structure and color, but not necessarily the kind of power associated with destroying industrial materials. The steel-chewing detail relocated the creature's threat from the visual register to the functional one, making clear that the danger it presented operated on a different scale than its size suggested. The card illustration that showed the behavior happening in real time made the claim more concrete than text alone. Sharpedo as the demo starter was a design team communication about how they wanted the new region to feel to players encountering it for the first time. The Hoenn starters were unknown. Their appeal was not yet established. Sharpedo was known immediately by players who had heard about the new generation, and it was aggressive and visually striking and carried the kind of immediate design impact that a demonstration needed. The choice said something about how the team understood the first impression of the new generation and about which creature they trusted to deliver it. Wailmer's e-reader uniqueness was the kind of distinction that had no strategic or narrative significance and existed purely as a technical fact about product category. Among all the Pokémon from that generation, one had received a format that required specialized hardware to interact with fully. That Pokémon was Wailmer, a round blue whale that was mostly remembered for its habit of spouting water and for the evolution that made it significantly larger. The distinctiveness of its e-reader card was entirely disconnected from any quality the creature itself possessed. Wailord's Pokédex record being superseded was a small lesson in how established facts became historical facts. The entry that described Wailord as the largest Pokémon was true when written. It remained in the game as written text after it became false. Players who read it in Diamond and Pearl after the record had been broken were reading a claim that was no longer accurate in the context of the franchise as it existed at that moment, preserved in the game's text as evidence of what had been true before subsequent generations added creatures that exceeded the measurement. Numel and Slowpoke's comparative study in unresponsiveness was a question the transcript source raised without committing to an answer, which was the right choice. The two entries described different things in different registers. Numel did not notice impacts. Slowpoke felt them after a delay. Whether not noticing was worse than noticing late, whether the absence of awareness was a greater deficit than delayed awareness, was a question about perception and experience that the Pokédex entries raised without resolution. The comparison was more interesting for remaining open. Camerup's 18,000 degrees was the entry that paired most naturally with Magcargo's comparable temperature in discussions about the game's relationship with physical plausibility. The two creatures each contained temperatures that would vaporize matter on contact in the actual world, and players raised them in parties, transferred them through trade systems, and stored them in Pokeballs without any of the physical consequences that the temperature figures implied. The games constructed a world where those temperatures were real and the creatures that contained them were safe to handle, and the players accepted that construction because the game asked them to and offered no contradiction to encourage doubt. Torkoal's fighting type designation in certain forms was a detail that sat in the game's data without being prominently featured in the creature's design or marketing or competitive identity. The connection between a coal furnace tortoise and the fighting type was not obvious from the visual design, and the fact that it existed in two forms rather than one made it slightly more present in the data without being any more prominent in how the creature was discussed or remembered. Spoink's incorporation into a pinball game was a design application whose logic was almost too appropriate to be interesting as a surprise. Spoink bounced. Pinball required a bouncing object with a spring mechanism. The creature and the application fit each other so naturally that the choice felt inevitable rather than clever. The pinball team had presumably looked at the available Pokémon and recognized immediately that Spoink was the answer, and the design decision that followed from that recognition required no additional justification. Spinda's 4.2 billion pattern variations placed it in a category of Pokémon whose individuality was encoded at a depth that the usual dimensions of individuality did not reach. Every Pokémon was individual in terms of IVs and natures and nicknames. Spinda was individual in terms of how it looked, in a way that made visual duplicates essentially impossible. The shiny extension of that individuality to 8.5 billion total patterns ensured that the space of possible Spinda was large enough to contain every player who ever caught one without repeating, with several billion possible patterns still unexpressed. Trapinch's Japanese name, as Nutcracker, reframed the design emphasis from geological behavior to physical capability. The antlion's sand trap, which the English name gestured toward, was a behavioral description. The Nutcracker name was a capability description, focusing on what the jaw could do rather than how the creature used its environment. Both were accurate aspects of the design, and the choice between them was a choice about which dimension of the creature to foreground in the name. Vibrava's headache-inducing wings made encounter difficulty diegetic within the world. Most Pokémon were difficult to catch for mechanical reasons, expressed through numbers and calculations that existed outside the game world's fiction. Vibrava was difficult to catch in the anime sequence because the wings affected the trainer's physical state in a way that the game world acknowledged as real. The difficulty was located inside the world rather than in the numbers outside it, which made the encounter feel different in quality, even when the outcome was the same. Flygon's missing Mega Evolution belonged to a very human story about creative difficulty. The artist assigned to the design could not find the right answer in the time available. The right answer not coming was not a failure of effort or attention. It was the honest outcome of a creative process that does not always respond to those inputs on schedule. The Mega Evolution was not made because the person who needed to make it could not make it in time, and the gap between the planned content and the released content was a gap shaped by the specific reality of creative work, rather than by strategic decisions or changed priorities. Cacnea's density was the kind of proportional fact that produced a reaction when the numbers were placed side by side without commentary. A single-foot-tall creature weighing 113 pounds was dense in a way that the cactus design did not visually communicate. Cacnea looked light, looked manageable, looked like a Pokémon that weighed what a cactus of that size might weigh. The actual number was considerably higher, and the gap between visual expectation and physical reality was precisely the kind of detail that made Pokémon numbers interesting to examine. Cacturna's blood becoming sand after thousands of years was a transformation described on a timescale that the games otherwise never addressed directly. Most Pokémon lore operated on human timescales, on the timescale of a trainer's journey, on the timescale of a legend that happened generations ago. Cacturna's desert adaptation was described on a geological timescale, acknowledging the actual time required for an environment to change an organism's chemistry. The acknowledgement of that timescale, brief as it was, placed Cacturn in a different kind of context than most Pokédex entries created. Swablu's typing transition from normal to dragon remained the only instance in the franchise of that specific journey. Normal type was the most common typing and was associated with a certain ordinariness, a baseline quality that other typings departed from. Dragon type was associated with rarity, power, and legend, with creatures that were exceptional and difficult to reach. The transition from the most ordinary typing to among the most extraordinary happened once, in a single evolutionary line, and the design gave that transition the visual vocabulary of transformation. Clouds becoming wings, softness becoming something with reach. Zangoose and Seviper's horde mechanics were a case of narrative lore translated into procedural game behavior. The enmity between the two species was described in their respective entries across multiple games, establishing it as a constant of the game world. The horde encounter where Zangoose turned on Seviper before addressing the player made that constant visible during actual play, inserting the lore relationship into the mechanical flow of a standard encounter. Players who had read the entries recognized immediately what they were seeing. Players who had not had the lore explained to them by the behavior itself. Their breeding compatibility, alongside their declared enmity, was one of those facts that the games handled through mechanical consistency. The egg group system did not ask about the lore relationship between creatures before assigning compatibility. It applied categories according to whatever logic had been used to establish them, and those categories occasionally produced compatibility between creatures whose lore positioned them as opposed to each other. The game could hold both facts without resolution because they operated in different systems that had been designed independently. Lunatone's Old Man story was assembled across 2 games without any single entry making the full narrative explicit. The Sun and Moon encounter gave players the behavior without explanation. The event distribution gave players the Pokémon without context. The connection between them required players to have experienced both and to have placed them alongside each other. The story existed only in the space between the 2 experiences, in the mind of the player who assembled them, which was a form of storytelling that required the player's participation to complete. Barboach's withdrawn episode was a reminder that the games existed alongside the world in which they were created, a world with its own history that occasionally intersected with the game's production in ways that shaped what could be released. The earthquake and the withdrawal of earthquake-related content was a moment when the game's fictional representation of geological events encountered the reality of those events having happened, and the production responded with a restraint that persisted for years afterward. Whiscash negating the Master Ball was the exception that made the rule interesting. A rule that had no exceptions was simply a fact about the game world. A rule that had one exception was a rule with a history. A rule that had been tested by a specific encounter and found to be more complex than its statement suggested. Whiscash was not more powerful than the Master Ball. Something in the specific conditions of that specific encounter produced a result that the item's description did not account for, and that result became part of the game's permanent record. Corfish's imported origin raised a question that was more interesting for remaining unanswered. The games that followed the Hoenn generation did not provide Corfish and Crawdaunt with a regional origin story or a home region. The detail that they had come from elsewhere remained the full statement, a fact about their past, without a resolution of what that past contained. The games occasionally introduced alternate forms for Pokémon tied to specific regions of their origin. The possibility that Corfish's unknown origin could eventually provide a foundation for such an alternate form was a small open door that subsequent games had not yet walked through. Crawdaunt's limited Dark-type move pool in the original Hoenn games was a case of the design's visual promise, exceeding the mechanical reality available to support it. The creature looked aggressive. The design implied power and danger. The move pool provided one damaging Dark-type option that was not, at that time, particularly powerful. Later balance changes would make Knockoff significantly stronger, aligning the mechanical capability more closely with the visual impression. But in the games where Crawdaunt was first introduced, the gap between appearance and available capability was more visible. Baltoy and Claydol's type uniqueness was one of those moments where the type system produced a combination that no other creature shared, giving the line a defensive profile that could not be replicated by any other Pokémon. The uniqueness was passive, in the sense that it did not give the line any special game text or indicator acknowledging that the combination was exclusive. It was unique in the type chart in the same way that any combination was unique through the specific intersection of the 2 types and the matchups that resulted from it. Claydol's Ancient Awakening was the anime using the creature's design vocabulary of ancient seals and stone preservation to construct a horror-adjacent narrative about what might happen if something sealed away for good reason was unsealed. The stone Pokeball as a prison, the awakening as a release of contained danger, the multiple trainers required to address it. The scene was built around the anxiety of what happened when things were allowed to continue past the point where they were supposed to be contained. The familiar, still claydol of regular gameplay carried none of that energy. The anime version borrowed the design and applied a different emotional register to it. Lileep and Cradley's 4-weakness defense was the product of a type combination that the designers had balanced carefully enough that the overlapping weaknesses canceled each other in ways that produced a surprisingly clean result. Rock and Grass were individually types with many weaknesses, including to each other's common threats. The combination eliminated some of those threats through the resistance or immunity provided by the complementary type, leaving only 4 vulnerabilities where the threats were genuinely shared. The result was more defensively compact than either type alone would have been. Cradley's real eye location was a design detail that most players carried incorrectly for years after encountering the creature. The forehead patterns were so convincingly placed that the assumption of there being eyes was essentially automatic. The correction, when encountered, required a genuine moment of reorientation, looking at a familiar design and finding the actual functional feature in a location that had always been visible but never registered as significant. The experience of being wrong about where a Pokemon's eyes were after having seen the design many times was one of those small recalibrations that these kinds of facts occasionally produced. Anorith and Armaldo's Swift Swim irony was a mechanical consequence of decisions made for different reasons at different points in the design process. The ability was probably given to them to provide competitive utility, a way to make the Pokémon faster in certain conditions. The conditions that activated the ability also happened to power up the one category of attack the creature was vulnerable to. The game did not draw attention to this. It was the kind of irony that existed in the structure of the system rather than in any individual decision, visible only to players who examined all the relevant pieces simultaneously. Armaldo's duplicate slash was an error that was never severe enough to require correction. The move was learned twice. Both instances were accessible through normal play. The practical consequence was that players could legitimately have 2 instances of the same move's flag in their memory if they checked carefully enough. No battle outcome was changed. No competitive result was affected. The error persisted because the space it occupied was too small to demand attention in a production of that scale. Phoebus and its 6 tiles were a design decision about the relationship between rarity and reward. The most difficult Pokémon to find in the region was also the Pokémon with the most dramatic transformation available, the pathway to Melodic. The difficulty of the discovery and the quality of the destination were matched in a way that made the scarcity feel purposeful rather than arbitrary. Players who found Phoebus and understood what it could become had been given something rare that contained a further rarity inside it, the chance at a creature that most players who played those games never raised. Castform's shiny forms arriving late was a reminder that the shiny system, while present in every game, was not applied with equal completeness to every form of every Pokémon simultaneously. The base form had a shiny, but the alternate forms that Castform spent most of its battle time in did not, until a specific event added them. The oversight was small and practical only in the sense that it meant players who caught a shiny Castform could not see the alternate coloration during battles and weather conditions. It was corrected when the opportunity presented itself. Kecleon's recruitment conditions were the game's way of acknowledging that some things should be earned through significant investment. The high-level requirement, the rare item requirement, the low base rate. All 3 together created a target that required resources, time, and luck in combination, each one of which was insufficient without the others. The resulting Kecleon, when finally recruited, was the same Kecleon that appeared everywhere in the game. The difficulty was the experience, not the reward. Shuppett's Reaper Claw theory gave the creature an origin in material culture rather than in biology, connecting it to the items that the games offered players as trade evolution catalysts. The theory was unofficial and speculative, but it operated within the established logic of the game world, where certain items were associated with ghost-type evolution, and where the connection between materials and the creatures they produced was never fully explained. The theory filled a gap with a mechanism that was consistent with the existing logic, which was the most that unofficial theories ever managed. Bennett's haunting of its former child was a Pokédex entry that used restraint to create unease. The creature remembered the creature was looking. The creature had not found its target yet, but the search was ongoing, and the memory that motivated it was not fading. What would happen when the search concluded was left entirely to implication. The game was aimed at a broad audience that included children, which made the restraint not just aesthetically appropriate, but practically necessary, and the result was a description that conveyed something genuinely unsettling without saying anything that could not be said in a game aimed at young players. Duskull's card pose caught a cultural reference at a moment of its maximum currency and preserved it in a piece of physical product that would outlast the moment itself. Trading cards had a longer physical life than the trends they sometimes captured, and a Duskull dabbing on a trading card was an artifact of a specific moment that collectors who encountered it in later years would recognize as belonging to a particular period in the franchise's history. Dusclops's Chochinobake referenced shiny was one of many cases in the franchise where the shiny palette was not simply a mechanical alternate coloration, but carried a specific cultural meaning accessible to players with the right background. The haunted paper lantern of Japanese folklore was a well-known image within the cultural tradition that had produced many of the franchise's ghost designs, and the shiny that evoked it was a small acknowledgement of that source material embedded in an alternate coloration that most players would never see. Tropius and its personalized fruit garden was a detail that made individual Tropius feel like characters rather than instances of a species. The fruit was not randomly assigned to all Tropius from a fixed list. The specific fruit that grew on a given Tropius was the fruit that specific Tropius preferred, which meant that every Tropius was expressing its own preference through its body, wearing its tastes visibly and perpetually. The absurd extensions of that logic, the watermelon-bearing Tropius, the pineapple Tropius, the Tropius whose neck fruit collection reflected an unusually eclectic palette, were all present in the logic of the entry without being directly stated. Chimeko's 7-note range was a design detail that connected the wind chime Pokémon to a specific musical structure rather than to the broader concept of music in general. The 7 notes of the scale, A through G, were a precise foundation rather than a vague association. The creature that made musical sounds was described as making exactly the sounds that constituted the basic vocabulary of Western music, encoded in a Pokémon that represented the simplest form of musical instrument, something that made a sound when the wind moved through it. Absol's disaster proximity was a consistent pattern that required multiple games to become visible as a pattern. In any single game, Absol's location near a future disaster site was a single data point. Across multiple games, the pattern emerged of a creature consistently present at locations where something significant and damaging would eventually happen. The creature was not causing the disasters. The disasters were what created the reason for Absol to be there, which was what its design had always stated. The pattern across games made that statement visible in a way that a single game could not. Why Not on Mirage Island was a combination of 2 separate rarity mechanics operating simultaneously. The rarity of the island's appearance and the rarity of the creature that could only be found there. The 1 in 10,000 probability of the island appearing on any given day made it already one of the game's more improbable discoveries. Finding Winnaut there added a second layer of difficulty that was not strictly necessary given how hard the island was to reach, but which made the encounter feel appropriately significant when it finally occurred. Snorin's good fortune and its black market destination was a small ethical note embedded in an anime subplot that most viewers engaged with as an adventure narrative. The luck that Snorin represented, the good fortune it was said to bring to homes it visited, was the quality that made it a target for people who wanted to sell that quality to others. The belief became the danger. The value attributed to the creature became the reason the creature needed protection. The structure of the subplot contained a small observation about how perceived value created exploitation that the adventure narrative never had to make explicit. Glaly's lick mission was a move pool decision whose logic was never articulated because move pool decisions rarely were. The face Pokémon that was entirely mouth could not use the mouth move. The explanation that existed was mechanical rather than narrative, a matter of how Glaly was categorized within the game's data, rather than a considered choice about what Glaly's face should be able to do. Smoochum's access to the same move was similarly a consequence of its category placement. The contrast between them was a byproduct of decisions made without reference to each other, rather than a deliberate juxtaposition. Cielio balancing Spheal on its nose was a behavioral detail that existed to make the evolutionary line feel like a family rather than a sequence. The pre-evolution did not simply precede the evolution in the type chart and the Pokédex number order. The evolution interacted with the pre-evolution in a specific way that implied ongoing relationship, as if the stages of development were not simply replaced by later stages, but coexisted, with the later stage maintaining a relationship to the earlier one through the playful act of balance. Walreign's thick-fat ice resistance was a design decision that made the creature maximally resistant to exactly the category of attack that its design most naturally invited. A creature made of ice and living in icy environments would logically be targeted with ice attacks by opponents who assumed the type would be effective. The thick-fat ability and the water/ice dual typing combined to make those attacks less effective than any other type combination available, turning the intuitive offensive approach into the least effective one. The design protected itself against its most obvious weakness. Clamperl's economic placement in the Pokédex was a small act of internal consistency that players who tracked item values across the game could observe. The pearl hierarchy that the entries described, with Clamperl's pearls potentially exceeding Shelder's by a factor of 10, mapped reasonably well onto the game's item values. The big pearl sold for more than the pearl. The relationship between the two items reflected the relationship the entries described between the two creatures' products. The consistency between Pokédex text and item pricing was not usually noted, but it was there. Huntail and Gorbis having island-based fan communities was a world-building detail that gave the version-exclusive mechanic a social dimension within the game world. The split between Huntail lovers on one island and Gorbis lovers on another was a small expression of how the game world's inhabitants related to the Pokémon around them, organizing themselves around preferences in ways that mirrored how players themselves divided along version exclusivity lines. The game world and the player world echoed each other through the detail. Gorbis and its feeding method were described in language that the Pokédex rarely used for Pokémon that were not explicitly categorized as horror adjacent. The description was accurate and clinical and did not soften the behavior for the sake of the creature's elegant appearance. The game could have described Gorbis in terms of its beauty and left the feeding behavior implied or omitted. Instead, the entry was direct about what the creature did and how it did it, which gave the design a dimension that the visual presentation alone would not have conveyed. Relicanth as proof of evolutionary perfection was a philosophical claim encoded in a Pokédex entry. The idea that a creature could be so well suited to its conditions that improvement became impossible, that 100 million years could pass without natural selection finding anything to change, was a claim about the nature of optimization that the entry made matter-of-factly. The coelacanth on which the design was based made the same claim in the real world, and the game transferred that claim into its fictional context without modification. Luwdisk and Hoenn were a small story about the irrelevance of statistics when other factors sufficiently compensated for the gap. The numbers described Luwdisk as a creature that should lose most battles against most opponents. Hoenn won with one anyway. The gap between the statistical expectation and the outcome was the measure of Hoenn's expertise, made visible through the specific improbability of the creature he chose to demonstrate it with. The scene was more interesting than a scene with a more conventionally powerful Pokémon would have been precisely because the improbability of the outcome was so clearly stated by the choice of actor. Bagon's cliff diving dedication was a Pokédex narrative about the relationship between aspiration and consequence. The creature wanted to fly. The creature's body was not equipped for flight. The creature's response to that gap between desire and capability was to repeatedly attempt flight anyway, trusting that the attempt would eventually produce the capability. The consequence was a hardened skull rather than flight, an adaptation to the method of attempting the goal rather than to the goal itself. The Rockhead ability formalized that consequence in the mechanical system, making the biological response to repetitive impact a numerical advantage in battle. Shelgon on Drake's team at level 52 was a small crack in the game world's internal logic, the kind of crack that appeared wherever the game's rules were applied inconsistently, or where the human beings who created the game made decisions without checking all the relevant constraints. The Pokémon was there, the level was there, the evolution threshold was there. The three facts did not align. The game continued anyway, as games did when such inconsistencies occurred, not requiring the inconsistency to be resolved before proceeding. Salamonce and Ruby's hat were connected across hundreds of chapters of manga through a single event that neither character fully processed in the present tense where it happened. The hat was a concealment. The scar beneath it was a memory. The salamence that created the scar was not connected to the hat by any visible indicator in the manga's visual language. The connection existed only in the backstory, in the information about what happened before the story began. Readers who knew the backstory saw the hat differently than readers who did not. The hat was always the same hat. What it meant depended on what you knew. Beldum with a catch rate of 3 was a design decision that placed difficulty of capture as a meaningful quality rather than a purely narrative one. The catch rate did not say that Beldum was powerful or important in the way that legendary Pokémon were. It said only that catching one required the same probability distribution as catching the rarest creatures in the game. Whether that was intentional or a consequence of some other design logic applied without full awareness of the implication was not publicly stated. The result was real regardless of its origin. Metagross as 4 fused Beldum was a design that made the final form's complexity a product of its history rather than a separate design choice. The supercomputer was built through accumulation, through merger and merger again, each fusion producing a more complex and capable entity. The design narrative encoded the evolutionary process as a form of assembly, which gave the Metagross line a different quality from most evolutionary lines, where the later forms were expansions of the earlier ones rather than products of their combination. Metagross's shiny appearances in the anime accumulated to give the gold-toned variant a presence in the animated series that few other shinies matched. The appearances were separated in time and context, one appearing in a wilderness setting and one appearing as a named character's partner, which meant that the same shiny was encountered in two different registers of the story. The cumulative effect was to make Metagross's gold coloration one of the more recognizable shiny designs in the franchise, helped by its visual distinctiveness. Regirock's scarab footprint connected the ancient golem to a tradition of sacred imagery that the games did not need to reference explicitly. The footprint was there in the game's data, visible to players who looked at it, carrying its reference quietly. Players who recognized the connection to Egyptian iconography found a layer of meaning in the design that players without that reference did not access. The design rewarded cultural knowledge without requiring it, which was one of the franchise's more consistent design principles. Regis's Ice Surprise was a behavioral detail so small that most players who encountered it did not register it as a detail worth noting. The golem responded to touch with something that read as surprise. The golem was made of ice. The surprise at contact with ice was the kind of small contradiction that could generate an interesting question if noticed and held briefly. What was it like to be surprised by contact with your own substance? The question did not have a Pokédex answer, only the implied behavioral response that prompted it. Registeel's turntable cry was a sound design choice that the anime was able to make audible in a way that game cries, playing through small speakers or compressed audio formats, could not always fully convey. The anime had the budget and the audio design capacity to render the cry with the quality that made the comparison to a Dahage turntable immediately apparent to listeners. The game's version of the cry contained the same qualities in compressed form. The anime's version made them unmistakable. Latias and Ash's cheek represented the franchise at one of its more ambiguous moments, a scene that committed to an emotional register without fully committing to an explanation of what the emotion meant. The Latias was a Pokémon who had developed an attachment to a human. The human was Ash. The expression of that attachment was physical and brief, and then the movie moved on. The ambiguity was probably intentional, a way of giving the scene an emotional quality that would register with viewers without requiring the film to address the implications directly. Latios and Latias, outpaced by Purugly, was a statistical fact that existed in the game's numbers, independent of any narrative context that would make it sensible. The numbers were what they were. The creatures they described were what they were. The ranking that resulted from comparing the numbers placed a large, sedentary cat above a pair of legendary creatures explicitly designed to move like jets. The game did not require the fact to make sense. It required only that the numbers be what the data said they were. Primal Kyogre's aerial moment in Pokémon Generations was a case of short-form animation expanding the implications of a design beyond what the games had shown. The games described Kyogre's domain as the deep ocean. The short showed it operating in the sky above the ocean, which the games had not depicted and which expanded the creature's perceived range of capability. The short was not an official game release, but it was official content, and it created a different understanding of Primal Kyogre's capabilities for players who saw it. Gruden and Arbok at 11 feet 6 inches was a proportional fact that the game presented without commentary, leaving the implication unaddressed in either direction. Groudon was not diminished as by sharing a height with Arbok. Arbok was not elevated. The numbers were simply what they were, and the comparison that followed from placing them beside each other was available to anyone who checked both entries and noticed. Rayquaza's catch rate and Mantyke's catch rate occupied adjacent positions in a system that was not designed to be philosophically coherent about which creatures should be easy to catch. The system was designed to create a range of difficulty experiences, with some creatures being accessible and some being very difficult, in ways that served the game's pacing and content delivery needs. Mantyke's catch rate and Rayquaza's catch rate were each set for reasons specific to their own design contexts. The comparison between them was a coincidence of the system, visible only when the numbers were placed beside each other. Jirachi's Tenzaku strips connected the creature's wish-granting function to the specific cultural mechanism through which wishes were made in the festival that the design drew from. The strips were not decorative additions to the design. They were the design's most specific cultural claim, the image that made the connection to Tanabata unavoidable for players who recognized it. The 7-day wake period, the festival's date on the 7th of the 7th, the strips used to write wishes. Each element of the design pointed toward the same source, making the creature one of the more thoroughly researched cultural references in the Hoenn region. Deoxys arriving in Kanto before Hoenn was a small timeline anomaly that the franchise had rarely produced with such legible specificity. The distribution date, August 31st of 2004, was a matter of public record. Emerald's release date was also on record. The gap between them was measurable in weeks. The Hoenn Pokémon that was classified as belonging to the region that had the most recently released main series games was made available to players through an older region's games before the newer region's games existed in players' hands. The anomaly was administrative rather than narrative, but it was real and precisely dated. These 135 facts are together a kind of biography of the region. Not the biography of the story, which moved through a crisis about ancient weather creatures awakening and a team of zealots trying to use them, but the biography of the world behind the story, the world in which these creatures lived their lives independent of any trainer's journey through them. The biography of what Phoebus looked like in 6 specific water tiles. The biography of a creature that had not changed for 100 million years. The biography of a creature still looking for the child that abandoned it. Hoenn was built to be explored, and the 135 Pokémon that inhabited it were built to be discovered. The facts about them were part of the discovery, available to players who wanted to look at the world more closely than the story required them to. The story asked players to stop the crisis, to catch the legendary, to become champion. The facts were there for anyone who wanted to stay longer, who wanted to understand not just what happened, but what the world was made of. What the world was made of was this: attention to real birds, and real beetles, and real festivals, and real agricultural practices, and real folklore. Attention to the distance between the largest Pokémon and the smallest, to the catch rate of the most powerful and the most accessible, to the eye location of a fossil creature and the flight ambitions of a small blue dragon. The designers of Hoenn were paying attention, and what they paid attention to ended up in the region, distributed across 135 Pokémon that carried it quietly through every playthrough of every player who ever chose one of 3 starter Pokémon and walked out of a small house in a small town on the edge of a very large world. Another quiet detail appears when returning to all of this from a distance, and that is simply how much was contained inside a single generation of games released on hardware that fit in a child's hand. The Game Boy Advance held a world that held 135 creatures, each of which held its own history, each of which carried something that the designers had noticed and encoded before they moved on to the next one. The scale of what was packed into those cartridges, measured not in polygon counts or map sizes, but in the density of intention per Pokémon, was something that became more visible the longer you looked at any individual part of it. The games that came after Hoenn were larger in many measurable ways. The games that came before it were simpler in many of those same ways. But the particular density of attention that went into each of the 135 Pokémon of Hoenn, the way each design connected to something real, something observed, something researched, was its own kind of achievement. It was the work of people who were paying attention to the world around them and choosing carefully what parts of that attention to embed in a game that would be played by millions of children who would carry what they found there for the rest of their lives. That is what these facts were always part of. Not just interesting details about catch rates and move pools, but the accumulated evidence of a creative team paying attention. The evidence is still in the games. The games are still in the world. And somewhere, on a handheld in a drawer or on a cartridge in a collection, Trico and Torchic and Mudkip are still waiting at the beginning of a small house, ready to begin a journey that contains all 135 of these quiet truths. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed drifting through these quiet moments, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. Let it play while you rest. You might discover something gentle before sleep takes you again.